With China and India gridlocked over their border disputes, a peaceful resolution isn't in sight. In fact, both nations are bolstering their military presence, which can easily spill over into an all-out war. If these nuclear superpowers clash, the military strength of both nations will decide the extent of the conflict. So, which nation has a stronger army, China or India? We'll compare the two countries side by side, starting with India. India's military strength can be determined based on many metrics, but its land forces are one of the most significant elements. Experiencing constant population growth since 1971, India has also raised a number of active duty soldiers. As of today, India has approximately 1.4 million active personnel and 300,000 reserve fighters. If needed, the country can enlist additional troops from a pool of nearly 320 million people available for military service. India has the edge over most other nations in terms of sheer numbers, but it also has a high-quality training program. The country is known for its proficiency in mountain warfare, even having a dedicated high-altitude warfare school, or HAS, a premier training center that prepares troops for some of the harshest battle environments. The ability of Indian soldiers to protect their homeland at high altitudes has been demonstrated several times throughout history. The most famous example is the battle for the Siachen Glacier, which sits at over 15,000 feet above sea level. This is the highest battlefield on the planet and is characterized by freezing conditions where most people die from the cold rather than gunfire. The unforgiving winter didn't stop Indian troops from prevailing over their opponents in the Siachen conflict, which saw India wage war against Pakistan for a 1,000 square mile territory. The intermittent clashes lasted for nearly 20 years and ended in a resounding victory for India that proved the courage and readiness of its soldiers. Having reliable fighters is essential. Most of the potential war against China will take place throughout the Chinese-Indian border, not just glaciers and other hard-to-reach areas. If India is to stand a chance against China, it needs more than just experienced soldiers. They need an artillery force to match. That's exactly what India has, thanks to its $70 billion military budget. On top of this, the country buys and develops tanks, missile systems, infantry combat vehicles, and other equipment that cements its place as a formidable military power. Let's break down India's military equipment by numbers. Currently, the country has approximately 4,600 tanks, 8,600 armored fighting vehicles, and 2,799 artillery units. But what's under the hood of those war machines? Is the technology modern or outdated? As it turns out, India's military equipment is pretty sophisticated. Take the T-90 tanks as an example. Developed and imported from Russia, the T-90 is one of the mightiest battle machines in India's arsenal. The tank's 125mm smoothbore main gun provides tremendous firepower and can fire high-explosive frag ammunition, reflex anti-tank missiles, and armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds. Not only that, but Indian soldiers can replace the tank gun without disassembling the inner turret. This lets them return the tank to action faster and more safely if its main gun is damaged. To complement a high-quality fleet of tanks, India has a reliable system of infantry fighting vehicles. Out of the 8,600 vehicles of the sort, the BMP-2 stands out. With a design similar to its predecessor, the BMP-2 is a serviceable and agile vehicle with a robust engine that's perfect for most missions. It also has reinforced armor, especially in the front, which is typically the most vulnerable part of this type of vehicle. The BMP-2 and most other Indian infantry combat vehicles have exceptional armament. Fitted with a two-man turret, it can take on groups of opponents with relative ease. The vehicle comes with a dual-fed 30mm cannon and a 73mm low-velocity gun. The cannon is especially impressive as it fires armor-piercing high-T and HE frag ammunition. It can obliterate armored targets from 1.5 miles away and ground targets from nearly 3 miles away. India's land troops sound reliable. But what about the country's air defenses? There are several strong points in the country's aviation forces, including 170 fighter aircraft. Most of India's aircraft, like the French Dassault Rafale, are characterized by versatility and interoperability. This means that the jets can easily conduct different kinds of missions and collaborate with allied aircraft. They also come with advanced communication systems to coordinate their assaults with other pilots for maximum efficiency. Another great thing about Indian fighter jets is that they can take on different roles. For example, a pilot can instantly switch the purpose of their plane from strike force to protective missions. Other uses of India's aircraft include reversibility, which is canceling tasks at the very last second, and gathering intelligence. Not only that, but India's combat aircraft also has high survivability and the capacity to engage targets in different environments. That's because the jets feature high-efficiency weapon systems and defense measures to keep the enemy from taking them down easily. For instance, if Indian pilots need to defend a base or a strategic area from Chinese planes, they can do so with EM and Mica-IR air-to-air missiles. Likewise, they can perform ultra-effective precision ground assaults with built-in AASM Hammer air-to-surface and Scalp EG cruise missiles. Finally, if the goal is to intercept and destroy enemy ships, AIM-39 Exocet sea-skimming missiles can be the difference maker. If some of the battles in the prospective war against China take place in congested, isolated areas that fighter jets can't access without a runway, India has more than 700 helicopters to deploy. Some of them are utility helicopters designed to transport troops and perform various logistics operations, but others are combat helicopters that can shower the enemy with gunfire and missiles. That's precisely what the MiL Mi-24 does. Imported from Russia, the helicopter is a reliable addition to India's air forces. It has a revamped wing design to maintain the vertical motion of the rotor by about 30% at high speeds, and can also hold suspended weapons. It's also equipped with a 3-wheel landing gear, double-tiered front leg, and 2 engines that generate more than 4,000 horsepower combined. As such, the Mi-24 can reach and land in distant areas rapidly and safely. In terms of weaponry, the Mi-24 and many other helicopters in the Indian fleet have revolving turrets with rotating 12.7mm machine guns that can hold well over 1,400 rounds. These are perfect for taking down groups of enemy soldiers in quick succession. India's helicopters also often have 4 blocks that can hold S-5 missiles, 4 bombs, and many napalm containers. They can even store air-to-ground rockets and anti-tank guided missiles for extra firepower. All of this translates to a powerful force which would definitely carry a heavy burden in the potential war against China. Another branch that would prove invaluable in a war against China is India's naval forces. The ongoing economic development and greater military spending have contributed to a well-balanced navy that's strong on all fronts. India has over 250 naval units, 11 of which are destroyers. This class plays a pivotal role in guarding India's coasts and protecting them from enemy ships. There are many high-end destroyers in India's armada, including INS Visakhapatnam. It's the latest addition to its fleet and represents the pinnacle of the nation's shipbuilding. In fact, it's one of the most advanced warships not just in India, but anywhere in the world. With a length of 538 feet, weighing in at 7,400 tons, it reigns supreme in the Indian Ocean. It's also powered by gas propulsion that features 4 cutting-edge gas turbines that can propel the warship at about 30 knots or 35 miles per hour. The weaponry of India's destroyers is just as impressive as the rest of the fleet. They're fitted with a wide variety of weapons that include mid-range surface-to-air missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, torpedo launchers, anti-submarine rocket launchers, and rapid gun mounts, all of which allow India to obliterate a wide range of naval threats. Mighty destroyers aren't the only strength of India's armada. The nation can also deploy more than 10 frigates, 20 corvettes, and 15 submarines to improve its fighting chances. But the undisputed ruler of India's fleet is INS Vikramaditya, a Kiev-class aircraft carrier that struck fear into the hearts of enemies since 2013 when it first entered service. Whether India engages its opponent or has to defend itself, this aircraft carrier can be an ace up its sleeve. It has many destructive missiles, such as surface-to-air projectiles, and a variety of high-caliber machine guns. What's also admirable about the vessel is that it can carry up to 36 planes, including 26 Mikoyan multi-role fighters and 10 Kamov helicopters. The impressive armament means that India can not only engage threats but also neutralize attacking enemy troops before they reach their intended targets. And it can do so from pretty much any position. The INS Vikramaditya has powerful engines capable of outputting 180,000 shp, or shaft horsepower, enabling the vessel to reach high speeds and support the rest of India's military from different locations. Now you're probably thinking, well-trained soldiers, robust tanks, destructive fighter jets, and a powerful navy are all nice to haves. But India is a nuclear force, isn't it? Absolutely. Although India hasn't officially released the size of its nuclear arsenal, some estimates suggest the country has more than 160 warheads at its disposal. These are by far the most powerful weapon in India's military, but we're covering them last since India is unlikely to use them in the potential conflict against China. If either side launched a nuclear warhead, It would probably cause a chain reaction that could plunge the world into World War III, which would end badly for both nations. This wraps up India's military strength. Let's now turn our attention to its rival, China. Although China is known for its technological investments, military spending comprises a large part of its GDP. More specifically, the nation allocated nearly 2% of its GDP to military, giving it a budget of almost $300 billion, which is almost 5 times more than India. In today's world, the country with the highest defense budget has a stronger military 99% of the time. That seems to be the case when it comes to today's belligerents. But let's analyze China's forces segment by segment to determine if it's true. In terms of manpower, it is no contest. Even though India has surpassed China as the most populated country on the planet, it still has fewer soldiers than China. With over 2 million active soldiers and an additional 2 million reserve personnel, China trumps India by a wide margin in this category. The nation can also source more troops if need be, given that the number of citizens available for conscription is just over 385 million, about 65 million more than what India can work with. Training-wise, China seems to do a good job of preparing its soldiers for an array of combat conditions and environments. The Chinese People's Liberation Army, or PLA, regularly undergoes rigorous training, and its members are renowned for their high discipline. But does discipline translate into combat readiness? It's hard to get a clear picture of how well trained the Chinese military really is. For one, the communist government rarely discloses details about its army, clouding everyone's perception of its military strength. Some sources say Chinese soldiers are fully fledged war machines, while others are skeptical of their battle readiness. It seems there's more merit to the latter viewpoint. The reason is simple. The PLA hasn't been in a major battle for over 4 decades, since it clashed with Vietnam in the Sino-Vietnamese War. Even though both sides claimed victory, it's hard to say who prevailed. One thing was certain, the PLA's invasion was far from successful. Vietnam retained its dominion over Cambodia for an additional 10 years and decimated China's military, killing over 30,000 soldiers. The ghost of this conflict still looms over the PLA, and the lack of first-hand combat experience is undeniable. Only a handful of war veterans are still in service, so it's no wonder why many doubt that Chinese soldiers are ready for an all-out war. Even China's official newspaper, People's Liberation Army Daily, is worried about the issue. Conveniently named peace disease, years of peace have resulted in unprecedented economic growth, but have also undermined military readiness. Even though China had a minor skirmish with its current regional rival in 1988, it's not enough to prepare its infantry for the potential high-altitude battles that it might have to engage in against Indian troops. As a result, if some of the fighting between China and India hinges on infantry only, India's experience with harsh environments and relatively recent combat experience would likely pave its way to victory. But as we all know, modern warfare isn't just about soldiers. Sometimes it's all about the machinery. Equipment plays an important role, and China seems to be head and shoulders above India in this respect. The first area where China outperforms India is in the number of tanks. The nation has about 5,750 tanks, which is approximately 1,000 more than the other side. And the technology of their main battle tanks is high level. This is most evident when you take a look at the Chinese Type 99. Featuring reinforced armor, it can withstand the impact of 120mm projectiles with ease. Some even claim that the front of the tank provides as much protection as 1,000mm of steel armor. The vehicle also has NBC protection and modular reactive armor that can be replaced quickly after it's damaged. Chinese tanks aren't just durable when facing direct impact, though. They're equipped with technology that can keep strikes from happening in the first place. For instance, the Type 99 features a laser protection network that utilizes advanced lasers to disrupt incoming missiles. If the enemy deploys gunners with bazookas or observation optics, the tank can use infrared guidance signals to stop the opponent in their tracks. The protection system is also effective against helicopters. To support its tank dominance, China can draw from its stockpile of more than 14,000 infantry combat vehicles, a fleet that's nearly twice the size of India's. There are many highlights of China's infantry battle vehicles, but the ZBD-08 might be the most impressive specimen yet. The Chinese drew inspiration for this vehicle from the Russian BMP-3, and although the Chinese version resembles the BMP-3, it is far more advanced. The unit has a redefined layout that addresses many drawbacks of the Russian version, eliminating the cramped exits and tightly packed troop compartments. It does so by putting the engine in the front and the crew cabins in the back, giving soldiers more room to operate the vehicle. Protection's also been elevated. The ZBD-08 has a steel hull and is compatible with modular armor that can add even more protection. Some suggest that the front arc can endure 30mm armor-piercing projectiles, while the sides neutralize 14.5mm rounds with ease. Like Chinese tanks, this vehicle employs laser protection systems to deter enemy missiles. When it comes to armament, the ZBD-08 and the rest of the Chinese infantry combat vehicles are just as reliable, if not more reliable than Indian vehicles. China often installs 100mm guns on these vehicles and autoloaders that can zero in on targets from up to 2.5 miles away. The vehicle's weaponry is highly versatile, as it can fire anti-tank and ordinary projectiles to neutralize India's main battle tanks. Given the larger number of tanks and vehicles, it's easy to see why China's equipment more than makes up for its lack of recent experience. The difference between the PLA and India is even more evident when you consider China's Air Force, which consists of about 2,000 more aircraft than India's squadron. Among the aircraft is the high-tech Chengdu J-20 fighter jet. The stealth war machine features supersonic inlet intakes and state-of-the-art low observable exhausts to maximize performance. The central weapon bay houses long-range air-to-air and precision-guided missiles. There are 2 additional weapons hubs behind the inlets primarily designed for short-range aerial combat. These secondary bays allow the pilot to close the bay door before releasing a missile to enhance stealth and catch the enemy off guard. The PLA is also famous for its world-class helicopters like the Z-10. Developed for high-octane air-to-air combat and anti-armor assaults, the helicopter has all it takes to decimate enemies in areas inaccessible to the J-20 and other fighter jets. It comes with a 30mm cannon as well as an HJ-9 anti-tank and TY-90 air-to-air missile to vanquish different types of threats. The Z-10 can even hold rocket pods and boasts armor plates, while the sloped sides reduce radar detection. With China's ground and aerial supremacy established, it's time to assess the PLA's naval capabilities. Does India at least stand a chance in this area? Probably not, considering the size of the Chinese armada. The country has nearly 750 naval units, dwarfing the 250 Indian vessels. The fact that China would emerge victorious in naval combat is even more obvious when you take the technology of the PLA's fleet into account. For example, the Type 55 destroyer is a mighty warship that can annihilate pretty much anything in its path stealthily. The enclosed forecastle conceals its anchor chains, mooring points, and other sections that would otherwise alert enemy radars and ships. It's even equipped with advanced smokestack designs that further eliminates the risk of detection and infrared signature. Regarding weapons, it hardly gets any better than Chinese destroyers. With 112 launching cells, the PLA's fleet can fire virtually any type of missiles, including HHQ-9 surface-to-air, YJ-18 anti-ship, CJ-10 land attack, and anti-submarine projectiles. To double down on its naval strength, the PLA can deploy 3 more aircraft carriers than India, with the highlight being the Fujian. It's the largest of all Chinese carriers and even rivals the USS Ford nuclear-powered vessel. It features electromagnetic catapults to launch heavier aircraft faster, 8 oil-fired boilers, and steam turbines that generate a whopping 220,000 horsepower for quick transportation. In the nuclear department, it's estimated China has over 400 nuclear warheads, compared to India's estimated 160. Should the potential war escalate drastically, China would handily overwhelm India. That brings us back to the central question: whose military is more powerful? Without any doubt, China's military is superior to India's, and by a large margin. The only area where India may outperform China is soldier training. Everything else, including tanks, infantry combat vehicles, aircraft, naval forces, and nuclear weapons, favors China. As we write this, you don't have to look far to find headlines in the media containing the words US and Iran and conflict. The BBC writes that the USA has sent over 1,000 troops to the Middle East because, according to the American Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan, Iran has been acting hostile. Iran has been accused of oil tanker attacks, and the country, it said, will also soon breach a 2015 deal regarding its uranium stockpiles. The New York Times has called this a new confrontation with the West. How bad could this get? What kind of a threat would Iran be? Is there really a threat at all when compared to the might of the US military? Let's have a look. If you watched many of our other military comparison shows, then you're likely already an expert when it comes to the arsenal of the US military. You'll know that the US spends more on defense than any other country by a long, long way. Sources differ, and it's hard to get the exact spending down to the last dollar, but in 2018 it's reported that the USA's defense budget was somewhere between $587 billion and $597 billion. But if you go to the actual US Department of Defense website, one of the first things you'll read is that President Trump plans to pump an extra $160 billion into defense. The prediction from the DoD, right from the horse's mouth, is that by the end of 2019, defense spending will have reached $686 billion. Where does all this cash go? Well, the DoD website just breaks it down into simply various departments: the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Joint Chiefs. If you're wondering what the Joint Chiefs are, well, they kind of run the show. Part of their mission statement reads, "The future operating environment will place new demands on leaders at all levels. Our leaders must have the training, education, and experience to meet those demands." It's not all about spending money on killer toys, of course, because you have a lot of paychecks at the end of the week. The U.S. military has 2,083,100 personnel. 1,281,900 work as active personnel, and 801,200 reservists. On top of that, you have all kinds of special units and specialists to pay. It's not free when the US, say, wants to buy artificial intelligence technology to scan faces, go through hours of drone videos, etc. Research and development, according to the US military, eats up a great deal of money. Thankfully, someone else has broken down the budget for us, and it goes like this. A little over $205 billion goes to the Navy, and the Air Force will basically get the same at $204.8 billion. $191.4 billion will go to the Army, and $116.6 billion will go to projects spread across the DoD. $104.3 billion will go to research, development, test, and evaluation. $143.1 billion will go to buying new things, such as expensive aircraft and ships. $155.8 billion will actually go to the actual men and women of the military through the paycheck budget. $22.5 billion will go to building houses for personnel and other military construction projects. $292.7 billion, the biggest part of the budget, is for maintaining the military. If you add all this up, though, it comes to more than the actual budget. That's because some of the spending overlaps, such as research, purchases, or wages, that might need to be accounted for as part of the individual forces' budgets. If you look at what the military has been buying or trying to buy, you'll see that the F-35 Joint Strike Fighters are a big item on the shopping list. These things also get sold, of course, but as we write this, Japan, according to some reports, is no longer looking at buying many more of them because it has created its own aircraft that it sees as superior. Nonetheless, if you follow military news, you'll know that these things are still selling like hotcakes. The US currently has around 200, plans to build a staggering 1,763 more. As we've said before, the US no doubt has the most powerful air force in the world, and we just cannot list everything that's in its arsenal of flying machines. But some of the most powerful beasts include the fleets of F-22 Raptors, F-15E Strike Eagles, F/A-18EF Super Hornets, and F-16 Fighting Falcons. Some of the newer machines are 15 KC-46 tanker strategic military transport aircrafts and also the B-21 stealth bomber. So, can Iran afford to spend billions and billions of dollars on just one plane alone? Well, the answer is a resounding no, and in fact, recent news reports tell us that the country has slashed defense spending to the equivalent of $43 billion. Compare this to reports in 2019 that the U.S. Navy just paid Virginia shipbuilder Huntington Ingalls $15 billion to start construction on the new Ford-class aircraft carriers. Also bear in mind the billions spent on new aircraft, or the two fleet replenishment oilers at $1.1 billion, the 5,113 Joint Light Tactical Vehicles costing $2 billion, or the M1 Abrams tank modification setting the U.S. back $2.7 billion. Just one new Columbia-class submarine will cost $3.7 billion, and the military has requested $6 billion for some DDG-51 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. The list goes on, and we cannot possibly tell you everything on that shopping list. But all in all, you have over 2 million personnel, around 13,400 military planes and counting, including about 5,700 helicopters. Add to that 6,287 tanks for land-based operations. Then on water, you have a total of 20 aircraft carriers, which are like a traveling army, and would be very important when fighting a country located on the other side of the globe. The USA also has 68 destroyers and 68 submarines, but as you know, more of both are in the pipeline. As you can see, this is shaping up to be a David and Goliath story. No one doubts that in terms of equipment, the USA has by far the biggest and arguably most advanced military in the world. We say arguably because countries such as China, Japan, the UK, India, France, Russia also have some very capable military toys. Iran, though, well, you won't find the country on the top 10 lists when it comes to military might, and some writers have described Iran's equipment as being Cold War-era machines. In total, Iran has 523,000 active military personnel, but also around 350,000 reservists. They own 509 military aircraft, which sounds fairly impressive, but let's see what kind of planes these are. For starters, they have 54 American-made McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom IIs. Some of these are pretty old, but we're told many have been upgraded. Joining the list are also some other capable multi-role aircraft, such as 23 French-made Dassault Mirage F-1s. As for ground attack, Iran has about 50 Russian-made planes and the Sukhoi Su range, the Su-22, Su-24, and 25. Iran is also in the process of building a fifth-generation stealth fighter aircraft called the IAIO Kaher 313. Although some experts have cast doubts as to how viable this aircraft will be. This is not a weak air force by any means, but much of that strength comes from purchased American military hardware. That said, much of this fleet is aging and in need of an upgrade, whereas the American military has never stopped upgrading their equipment, whether they need it or not, as any American taxpayer can tell you. As for tanks, Iran has 1,634 of them, but we might ask just how advanced these tanks are. Well, again, the country owns quite a few older models bought from the USA, Russia, and has also some homemade tanks. But in 2018, Iran's Deputy Defense Minister Reza announced that the country was in the process of building another 700 to 800 new tanks. The country also has 2,345 armored fighting vehicles. But compare that to the 39,223 armored fighting vehicles in the USA, which for the most part are much more modern. But where Iran is really weak is in the water, as it doesn't have a single aircraft carrier to speak of. Remember, the US has 20. The country has no destroyers either, but does have a 34-strong submarine fleet and 6 frigates. While Iran really is an underdog to the US military, that doesn't mean it isn't a strong military. Ranking militaries is difficult and shouldn't be taken as an exact science. Iran has had to be a strong military presence before, and it has a large, well-trained military because of its location in a volatile region. Reporting has stated that they have a ground force that includes over 1,600 tanks, 725 reconnaissance and infantry fighting vehicles, 640 armored personnel carriers, 2,322 towed and self-propelled howitzers, and 1,476 multiple rocket launchers. Yes, the numbers can change, since we guess the press doesn't have a regular tank counter working all over the world, but we're guessing these numbers are pretty close to reality. Much like their air fleet though, much of this equipment is somewhat outdated and likely needing of either upgrading or a full replacement. Now, we already know that the USA has some of the most advanced special forces units in the world, and also is not bad at collecting intelligence through the CIA, NIS, and both of their cutting-edge computer technologies. But the Iranian forces have also a special branch that is said to be very highly trained and is an entity to be feared, the Quds Force, a special ops unit within Iran's Revolutionary Guards. They number around 15 to 30,000 very skilled agents and work in what you might call unconventional warfare. Iran also has the advantage in the event of an invasion of being a geographically difficult country to assault via land. It's a large country and the major cities are mostly located in areas that would be difficult for land forces to quickly reach. And now we come back to the start. What about these new fears of nuclear conflict? The New York Times writes this: Iran is still well more than a year away from being able to build a weapon, perhaps much longer. But the experts in the article also said it would take much longer to produce what the Times called a deliverable weapon. It's highly unlikely Iran is thinking about attacking the USA. And many European countries have blamed the US for putting Iran in a difficult position thanks to harsh sanctions. We won't get into the politics, but suffice to say, confrontation of military powers with nuclear weapons is not something anyone wants. As Newsweek points out, while the US military is by far superior in every way, an invasion would be a long, drawn-out affair. They wrote, "If decades of difficult conflicts worldwide have taught the American military anything, it's that a mighty armory goes only so far. Let's hope for some diplomacy that works for both nations and the threat of a conflict behind us."
The US and Russia, China and India, two separate long-term rivalries and two flashpoints for global war. But what if China and Russia decided to set aside their differences and join against an Indian-American alliance? Who would win, and how would that war play out? The rules of this war game are, as usual, no use of nuclear weapons allowed, and no other allies can be called upon. First, let's take a look at each contestant's military might and see what capabilities each would bring to the table. First up is India, the world's fourth most powerful military. With an active duty force of 1.4 million and a reservist force of 2.8 million, India can call upon a deep pool of manpower to prosecute any war. India also possesses a formidable air force with 590 fighter aircraft, 804 attack aircraft, and a huge fleet of surveillance and transport helicopters that numbers at 720. India, however, suffers from a lack of attack helicopters with only 15 in its inventory. This may prove to be a crippling deficiency in any attempt to combat a Chinese-Russian incursion over its mountainous northern and eastern borders. India does, however, maintain a force of 4,400 combat tanks, of which about half are modern or semi-modern T-90s and the indigenous Arjun main battle tank. India is also equipped with a staggering number of towed artillery, 4,100 pieces, meant to make it impossible for their Chinese rivals to penetrate Indian defenses across the mountain gaps of its northeastern border. Its naval forces include 1 aircraft carrier, 14 frigates, 11 destroyers, 22 corvettes, and 16 submarines, a sizable collection of naval hardware that its immediate threat, China, would be hard-pressed to defeat. Next up is China. China is the most populous nation on Earth and maintains an active duty force of 2.2 million with a reservist force of 510,000. With an air force totaling 1,125 fighter aircraft, 1,527 attack aircraft, and 281 attack helicopters, China has a serious advantage in the air over India. Yet China's pilots are undertrained compared to their Western counterparts and forced to fly under strict supervision from ground controllers, a huge liability in fast-paced modern air combat. China also has a force of 7,700 tanks and 6,246 towed artillery, backed up by 2,000 self-propelled artillery, mostly ballistic missile launchers, which would pose a significant threat to Indian and American forces. On the sea, China maintains a significant force with 1 test aircraft carrier not rated for combat operations, 50 light frigates, 29 destroyers, 39 corvettes, and 73 submarines. While larger in number than Indian naval forces, China lacks the ability to maintain long-term logistical support for any deployed ships, meaning only a small number of them could operate far from China's shores for longer than a few weeks. Underpinning China's military might is also the fact that its military is severely affected by systemic corruption, so much so that China's own leadership doubts the ability of the Chinese military to fight and win a major war against a near-peer power such as India. On to Russia. Russia has the world's second most powerful military, with an active duty force of just over 1 million personnel and a reserve force of 2.5 million. With 818 fighter aircraft and 1,416 attack aircraft, Russia's air forces are formidable, but would be severely hampered in war by a lack of reconnaissance assets. As one Russian military analyst put it, "We have long-range, sometimes precision-guided weapons, but we don't always know where the target is." On the ground, though, Russia maintains the world's largest tank fleet, numbering over 20,000. However, this figure should be taken with a grain of salt, as the number includes many thousands of Soviet-era tanks that have long been decommissioned and would need weeks to bring into service, and even once operational, would be decades behind in capability, firepower, and protection versus modern tanks. Russia's naval fleet has severely atrophied since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it still maintains 1 aircraft carrier, 9 frigates, 13 destroyers, 78 corvettes, and 62 submarines. Though Russian vessels are on the whole aging and plagued by maintenance issues, they are still armed with very modern and capable long-range missiles, making them a force to be feared. And finally, the world's chief military power, the United States of America. The US enters the conflict on India's side with an active duty force of 1.3 million personnel and 800,000 reserve personnel. With 1,962 fighter aircraft and 2,830 multi-role aircraft, the US has almost double the air power of Russia or China. Its naval aviation forces alone are on par with either nation. Its fleet of 973 attack helicopters ensure that ground offensives are well covered, and it is rare that an American infantryman finds himself without fire support. A proponent of blitzkrieg warfare, America also maintains a fleet of 5,900 tanks, almost all of them modern Abrams variants, and 39,000 armored fighting vehicles, giving its ground forces unparalleled mobility. While lagging behind in numbers, America's 950 self-propelled, 795 towed, and 1,200 rocket artillery platforms often feature smart, precision-guided munitions. In fact, of all the militaries in the world, the United States uses the most precision-guided munitions, featuring them on almost every combat platform and giving US forces incredible lethality. At the onset of war, Chinese and Indian border forces stationed across the length of the Himalayas would come into immediate conflict. While initial predisposition of forces favors the Indian Army, the narrow roads and valleys of the mighty Himalayas would make anything but meager gains all but impossible. Artillery would devastate any sizable forces trying to move through mountain gaps, leaving most of the combat action to light infantry units supported by helicopters. With Chinese forces primarily stationed along its eastern coast, India would initially have the upper hand both in the air and on the ground. Only a few air bases on the Tibetan Plateau could support combat operations for the Chinese, while dozens of airfields on India's side could put all Indian planes within combat range of the front lines. It would take weeks for China to construct makeshift airfields and airbases, and then rebase the bulk of its air fleet to the Tibetan Plateau, during which time, despite more advanced Chinese aircraft, Indian forces would enjoy a degree of air superiority. Yet the mountainous terrain would make it difficult for India to exploit that air superiority, and it would be forced to try to use ground attack planes when it would be far more efficient to use attack helicopters, of which India, again, only has 15. Once China relocated its mobile ballistic missile launchers to its western military regions, however, India would face a withering barrage of ballistic missiles that it could do absolutely nothing to protect itself from. Airfields and military command and control nodes across northern and eastern India would be devastated, and India's Air Force would suddenly find it very difficult to maintain hard-won air superiority, giving China the time needed to rebase its own air forces. Yet this is where China would have to make a very difficult choice. If it moves its forces to counter the Indian threat, it will leave the Pacific front completely vulnerable to American attack. Caught between the literal rock of the Himalayas, swarming with Indian infantry, and the hard choice of leaving itself vulnerable to coastal raids by the American Navy, China may look to its Russian allies for a solution. Russia would need to carefully consider the strategic situation. Its Chinese allies desperately depend on the Pacific Ocean for trade, importing most of their oil via sea trade routes and with domestic reserves not yet ready to support long-term war. With the majority of China's trade and oil passing through the Indian Ocean, the Indian Navy is, as one analyst put it, poised on China's jugular and could easily cripple China with a naval blockade of Chinese shipping. America's Pacific forces are, on their own, also more than sufficient to cripple the Chinese economy with a trade blockade, and China's Navy could not hope to counter America on its own. Desperately needing to ensure the oil lifeline stays open for its ally, Russia would likely try to bolster its Pacific fleet with large elements of its northern fleet. Yet, depending on the time of year, the Arctic ice may not have melted enough to open up shipping lanes. Either way, whatever naval forces Russia could muster on the Pacific would be needed to aid the Chinese in fending off the American Navy. This would still not be enough to save the Chinese economy, however, as India's Navy would never have to leave home to stop all Chinese shipping in the Indian Ocean. With a very limited capability to support its own navy far from its shores, China could at best scrounge together a small battle group of destroyers and cruisers with perhaps a few nuclear submarines to try and break the Indian blockade. Yet with India operating so close to home shores, it could take advantage of shore-based air power and make quick work of any Chinese task force. In the end, China could not hope to stand against naval blockades by both the US and India, even with reinforcements from the Russian Navy. This is China's glaring Achilles heel, its almost complete reliance on the sea for trade and oil, and why China has been ambitiously undergoing its modern Silk Road infrastructure development program with friendly nations, with very mixed success. Caught between the threat of raids on its Pacific coast by the US Navy and Indian forces pushing through the Himalayas, China would likely choose not to deploy its ballistic missiles to the west, as even if India managed to break out of the Himalayas, China's western territory is largely of little economic value. It would be far more prudent for China to try to keep America's carrier groups at bay with its DF-21 ballistic missiles, though China has still, to date, failed to show it has the capability to follow through on the threat of its ballistic missile forces by displaying a mastery of the various tracking, recon, and targeting systems and assets needed to go from launch to successful kill, or the ability to properly defend them from US attack. At best, the Sino-Russian alliance could hope to hold India at bay in the Himalayas and could likely even push India back once Chinese and Russian personnel created enough forward air bases on the Tibetan Plateau to support offensive operations. Yet Chinese and Russian forces would be limited to advancing only as far as the Indian foothills on the western edges of the Himalayas. The narrow passes and undeveloped roads through those passes would not make it possible to transport large amounts of hardware into India itself, while India could hold vast amounts of tanks and artillery on its plains ready to crush any advance into Indian territory. In short, it would be guaranteed suicide to try to break out of the Himalayas for both the Chinese and Russian forces. Meanwhile, India and the US could starve China into submission by devastating its economy through naval blockades. It would take weeks for the US to degrade Russia's and China's naval and air forces enough to attempt an amphibious assault against either nation, but the high casualties would make it a very unappealing proposition. Instead, the US could comfortably sit back and bottle the Russian fleet up while systematically destroying the Chinese fleet, leaving their Indian allies to continue denying China's desperately needed oil imports. A US-India and Russia-China war would end with very little territory gained or lost on either side, and with staggering amounts of casualties for Indian and Chinese forces. The US Navy would likely see significant casualties, but both Russia's and China's navies would be all but completely destroyed. China and India's economies would be devastated, but China's specifically could face a catastrophic collapse that could even lead to the end of its Communist Party's rule. With so much to lose and practically nothing to gain, neither side would ever seriously consider such a war, but if they did, China's inability to protect its sea trade routes would make one side the clear victor. A superpower is defined as a state with the ability to exert influence or project power on a global scale, and if needed, in more than one region of the globe at a time. The United States, currently the world's sole superpower, fits this description, with an official military doctrine that states its military forces must be ready and capable to fight two major theater wars simultaneously, a capability no other nation on Earth can even approach. But what would happen if the United States found itself in a war against the entire rest of the world? How would that war potentially play out? The rules of this war game will be as follows. No nuclear weapons allowed, and war will be simulated to have broken out after weeks of preamble. As in a surprise attack, the United States with its forces spread around the world would likely lose its non-homeland forces entirely, but not before delivering crippling blows to most of the world's major powers and knocking them out of the conflict early. The US's main opposition would be in the form of a European coalition to include Russia and a China-India alliance. The rest of the world's contribution would be mostly in material supplies or financial backing, as while even nations like Japan boast a formidable military capability, they mostly lack the ability to actually deploy that power outside of their own borders. In fact, that would be the biggest hurdle to any global offensive against the United States. With historical military preparations focused on conflicts such as NATO versus Russia or China versus India, most militaries around the world lack the ability to transport military hardware across the oceans in a meaningful quantity, making a decisive assault against the US homeland impossible. Meanwhile, due to its commitments to fighting wars well outside its own borders for the last 80 years, the United States operates the world's largest air and naval transport fleets that number in the hundreds of ships and aircraft, more than most modern nations combined. This lack of mobility will prove to be a major weakness for the global alliance and severely hinder their ability to respond to US actions. Today, the United States operates its forces in every geographic area of the world and has split its command structure into 9 combatant commands, 6 responsible for global geographic areas of responsibility. In the weeks leading up to the outbreak of war, the United States would likely pull its forces out of Europe and non-American bases in the Pacific, disbanding its European, African, and Southern commands. Pacific Command, Northern Command, and Central Command would absorb these forces. Battlefield 1, Middle East. US Central Command would receive an influx of former European assets, with the US bolstering its forces in the Middle East in bases in Afghanistan and Iraq with one goal: destroying the major oil refineries and distribution centers while denying access to the sea lanes that transport oil from the region. 81% of the world's oil reserves are located in OPEC countries, and over 60% of the world's oil passes through the Arabian Sea alone. The US's strategic goals would be simple: shut off the global oil tap. With the world's 12th largest oil reserves, the United States could easily supply itself while denying the rest of the world access to vital Middle East oil. Europe, which would represent the United States' most formidable adversary, relies on Middle East oil for 40 to 50% of its total annual use, meaning an American stranglehold on the region would cripple any European war effort as reserves run out and their economies begin to collapse. China would face a similar problem, as 50% of its total oil imports all come from the Middle East, making the region the first front in our war. At the outbreak of war, the United States would first strike at oil production and distribution facilities across the Middle East via carrier-based strike aircraft backed up by former European theater aircraft, now based off American bases in Iraq and Afghanistan. With the world's largest air tanker fleet and flanking the all-important Persian Gulf from both Iraq and Afghanistan, American aircraft could penetrate deep into Middle East territory with impunity, striking at targets from the Straits of Hormuz all the way to the Suez Canal itself. Though regional forces would be able to offer some initial resistance, most operate outdated Soviet-era or non-modern American-built aircraft, with the exception of current US allies such as Saudi Arabia, who would be able to field modern variant F-15s, Typhoon Eurofighters, and Italian-British Tornado multi-role strike aircraft in small numbers. Without European support, however, the air war would go very poorly for Middle East powers for several reasons. Firstly, lacking a joint unified command, each nation would be unable to coordinate its air assets with its neighbors, resulting in confusion and low sortie rates. Most Middle East powers also field very few electronic warfare or early warning and control aircraft. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel would represent the most formidable threats to American air power, yet neither nation fields dedicated electronic attack aircraft, while the US is equipped with over 200, mostly F-35 variants and EA-18G Growlers. Without adequate numbers of AWACS and electronic warfare assets, Middle East powers would be unable to coordinate the large amounts of sorties needed to counter US air power, and they'd find their aircraft and ground-based air defenses actively jammed or spoofed by American EW assets. In the opening days of the Middle East War, the US would likely see moderate casualties among its air forces, as it would be mostly operating against obsolete aircraft and disorganized or inexperienced air forces. The greatest threat to US craft would come from ground-based air defenses, which range in obsoletism, yet remain a formidable obstacle to US air power. With a concentration of American power in the region, it's a foregone conclusion that Middle East powers would have begun to move their air defenses to protect vital oil shipping routes and manufacturing/distribution centers. Yet Desert Storm proved how effective the United States can be at dismantling a nation's air defense network, and most nations in the region have invested little into modernizing their defense infrastructures in the years since. The US would suffer most of its losses to its fourth-generation aircraft such as its F-15, F-16, and F-18s, while its fifth-generation F-35s and F-22s would prove much more difficult to contend with. With an inventory of 385 active F-35s, over 1,800 more on order, and 197 F-22s, the US retains the only operational fifth-generation air fleets, with current allies fielding a token force of F-35s purchased from America, and the Russians and Chinese still not fielding combat-ready fifth-generation aircraft. Despite its technological and operational superiority, however, sheer numbers would present a threat to American forces. So instead of seizing key oil production or distribution facilities, the US would instead focus its efforts on keeping those facilities and trade route choke points shut down while defending against attacks on its air bases. A single sunk supertanker could block the Suez Canal for weeks, shutting down one of the most important oil trade routes in the world, while constant harassment by American air power would make the Straits of Hormuz impassable. With few major naval threats in the Pacific, American Pacific naval forces would be split between containing China and bolstering US Central Command forces in establishing a blockade of trade routes across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. With 20 carriers, 11 of which are supercarriers, more than the rest of the world combined, a blockade of the Indian and Pacific Oceans would be easily achieved. With a staggering 80% of global oil trade passing through the Indian and Pacific Oceans, the rest of the world would be forced to abandon any plans to attack the US homeland and first try to dislodge the Americans from the Middle East. Yet they would be doing so while operating on a ticking clock as domestic oil reserves begin running dry. In a prolonged conflict, immediate development of oil reserves in Russia would begin, though with only 80 billion barrels of proven reserves versus over 800 billion in the Middle East, it would be imperative for the global coalition to dislodge the US from the region or face eventual oil starvation and defeat. Europe would be faced with the difficult decision of committing the majority of its air and naval power to a Middle East campaign, yet with an American navy larger than the next 8 navies in the world combined, they would be doing so at the risk of leaving their coasts vulnerable to harassment from American attack submarines and carrier strike groups. American attack submarines in particular would prove to be an overwhelming force, with 55 nuclear attack subs alone. Europe, to include Russia, fields nearly 100 submarines, yet only about a third of those are nuclear-powered and range from 10 to 25 years behind US subs in tech. Lacking in major transport capabilities and the ability to adequately protect either their sea lanes or any attempts to move troops by sea, the global coalition would be extremely hard-pressed to dislodge the US from the Middle East. While an eventual overwhelming of US ground forces would be possible, it would take weeks of buildup and slow moving of forces via ground routes to avoid American submarines. Victory in the Middle East would be possible for the global coalition, but would only come at great expense of dwindling oil reserves, and any attempts to reopen the Middle East trade routes would certainly fail, as the US would concentrate its nuclear attack subs and carrier battle groups in the region. The coalition would be forced to rely on existing land-based pipelines, though these would not be enough to sustain the world economy, and the United States would certainly commit its stealthy B-2 bombers to the destruction of these pipelines and any attempts at building new ones. In short, a land victory would be probable for the global coalition, but without the ability to challenge the US Navy, global trade routes would be permanently shut down, effectively crippling the economies of coalition nations and the war effort. Battlefield 2, West Pacific. The West Pacific and South China Sea is the most economically important waterway in the world, with a full 1/3 of all global trade passing through the area, or about $5.3 trillion. China, South Korea, and Japan would especially have a vested interest in keeping these sea lanes open, yet none of those nations field a true blue water or deep ocean navy. In a global war, the United States would invest the majority of its expeditionary firepower in the West Pacific, having little to fear from an Atlantic incursion by European powers due to their lack of major military transport capability and navies designed for decades to engage Russian ships in literal combat rather than blue water operations. Japan would pose a significant challenge for US forces due to its very modern and robust self-defense forces, yet the island nation could be largely ignored due to Japan's lack of air tankers, limiting the range of its strike aircraft and 70-year self-defense military doctrine, which saw the nation only recently begin to build an expeditionary capability. With 155 F-15s making up the bulk of Japan's air force and only a combat range of 790 miles, it is doubtful the island nation would risk its 5 operational airborne refueling tankers to attempt offensive operations against the US Navy and its over 1,000 fighter aircraft, instead holding its air forces in reserve in case of an American attack on the homeland. The US's first goal in the region would be to cut off all trade routes passing through the South China Sea. China would represent the US's biggest global adversary, yet like every other global power, to include Russia, it too lacks the navy and the transport capability to actually threaten the US homeland. In order to deny the nation the opportunity to build this capability, the US would immediately move to cut off Chinese trade through the South China Sea, something China would be particularly vulnerable to as over 60% of its trade is delivered by sea. Though China lacks a navy formidable enough to threaten US Pacific forces, it more than makes up for this shortcoming with its ballistic missile forces. Its DF-26 ballistic missiles each have a range of 3,000 to 4,000 kilometers and would threaten any US base or ship as far out as Guam. At the outbreak of war, China would immediately launch a withering missile strike against American facilities on Guam. While Guam would be defended by THAAD, or Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Anti-Missile Systems, Aegis-equipped destroyers, and Patriot missile batteries, China would rely on heavy saturation strikes and overwhelm American missile defense systems, decimating the majority of American ground targets on the small island and rendering it inoperative as a military forward staging area for weeks. This would force America to rely on its naval assets in the region, which would be the secondary targets of China's opening barrage. Though long touted as carrier killers, China's DF-26 and DF-21 ballistic missiles each rely on a very long and complex kill chain, or chain of military assets required to recon a target, track it, and guide a missile to it. In order to accomplish this, China operates 30 Yaogan tracking and reconnaissance satellites grouped into constellations that, working together, would provide China 16 opportunities per 24-hour period to accurately target a US Navy vessel to within 10 kilometers anywhere in the Pacific. The US would certainly seek to counter this capability with deployment of its anti-satellite weapon systems, of which it remains extremely secretive about. It is impossible to infer just how effective US anti-sat weapons truly are due to a lack of information, but it is known that in the early 2000s, the US Air Force successfully tested a deployment of mini-sats designed to kill or hijack enemy satellites, and in 2008, the US successfully targeted and destroyed a defunct satellite with an SM-3 missile launched from the USS Lake Erie in the Pacific. With every US destroyer and cruiser able to carry the SM-3, this could potentially pose a serious threat to Chinese space assets and degrade the capabilities of their ballistic missile forces. In a push into the Pacific, however, the US would still suffer heavy casualties among its fleet due to Chinese long-range missile strikes. It's probable then that while it works to destroy Chinese space assets from afar, America would instead send its nuclear attack submarine fleet to blockade Chinese waters. China operates about 60 submarines, yet for years, those subs did not go on patrols or even leave port as they were often sidelined by maintenance issues. Only as recently as 2011 did Chinese subs actually begin to leave port, giving US subs the opportunity to tail them and discover that Chinese submarines were surprisingly easy to find and track due to their noisy nature. Defense experts estimated that Chinese sub technology was 10 years behind Russia and about 20 years behind the US. The US, meanwhile, operates 55 nuclear attack submarines, with most of these being of the modern Virginia class. Armed with torpedoes and a complement of Tomahawk cruise missiles, Virginia attack subs could easily threaten Chinese surface and subsurface vessels and join its Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines in cruise missile attacks against Chinese inland industrial and military installations. While in recent years, China has invested heavily into improving its anti-submarine warfare capabilities, it is still critically behind even regional powers such as South Korea and Japan, meaning that in the end, there is likely little China could do to stop US attack subs. Though it could likely keep American carrier battle groups out of the South China Sea for the first week or two of the war, China would be helpless to prevent a naval blockade by US attack subs. India, also reliant on South Pacific trade routes, would certainly dispatch its naval forces to attempt to break a US blockade, but would face the same issues in challenging US subs that China would. Having only 15 active submarines, and also lacking in modern anti-submarine warfare capabilities, the Indian Navy would quickly find itself overpowered by American attack subs. Employing a combination of its submarine and anti-satellite assets, the US would likely break through the Chinese ballistic missile shield within 30 days and enact a complete blockade of the South Pacific, strangling regional powers economically. With a blockade of Middle East oil exports, the global war would then become a war of attrition, with the US starving out the world's major powers while able to sustain itself off its own domestic oil reserves. Having little to fear from a European transatlantic offensive due to Europe's lack of major military transport capabilities, American forces would be free to initiate ground offensives against Canada and Venezuela in order to seize its oil reserves as well. Ultimately, the US Navy, the largest and best equipped in the world, would be the deciding factor in a global war. With such overwhelming firepower superiority, the United States would be able to fight defensively and without launching any major ground offensives outside of North America. Fielding a larger fleet than the next 8 navies combined, the US Navy, backed by the US Coast Guard, could easily defend the Atlantic sea lanes from any European incursion, while enacting blockades of major oil shipping routes through the Persian Gulf and Indian and Pacific Oceans. While the world would eventually be able to muster a large enough force to threaten the US, current military capabilities across the globe would be insufficient to prevent these naval blockades and would require years of buildup and expansion of navies from every modern nation. With the majority of global oil trade shut off by naval blockade, however, European and Asian economies would quickly shrink or outright collapse, making such a buildup improbable and ensuring an eventual US victory. Yet that victory would come at a titanic cost to even the US's own economy, and in the end, the entire global economy would likely shrink to levels not seen since the end of the Second World War. When we look at the strongest militaries in Asia, there is little doubt that there is a big four: Russia, which is technically Eurasian, China, Japan, and India. Not too far behind are Turkey, which is also technically Eurasian, and South Korea. But if you look at military strength indexes, Asian countries such as Pakistan, Israel, Vietnam, North Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, and Thailand all have strong militaries. But today, we're going to focus on Asia's weakest links in this episode of the Infographic Show, Top 10 Weakest Armies in Asia. Number 10, Sri Lanka. With a total of just over 300,000 military personnel, this isn't exactly a small army, but the problem is not manpower, but the lack of equipment. In fact, global security tells us that until recent times, the country didn't have much of a military industry. Over recent decades, the army was busy though, fighting Tamil militant groups up until almost a decade ago. A black mark for the military followed, with the Sri Lankan armed forces being accused of war crimes against the Tamil Tigers. As for equipment, we are looking at some very old tanks of Russian and Chinese origin, while the Air Force's best asset is an aging multi-role fighter, the Israel Aircraft Industries Kafir. There is barely a navy to speak of, but the country does have a rather large collection of patrol boats. The military budget for 2017 was $1.8 billion, but Jane's Defense Weekly tells us that for 2018, it's been increased to $1.9 billion. Number 9, Qatar. Okay, so you might be thinking, what on earth is Qatar doing on this list? The country has money coming out of its ears. Well, the reason it's here is because its military is so small, there are probably more US personnel eating sushi right now than there are personnel in the entire Qatar military. Qatar's armed forces number at 12,000, and you can't do much with that small a military. On the other hand, the country has been branching out. Added to its $1 billion plus defense budget since 2015, Qatar has been busy spending more billions on new toys, perhaps the best of which was a fleet of French Dassault Rafale aircraft. Qatar also ordered fleets of F-15Es and Eurofighter Typhoons. This will mean a very powerful air force, but with a weak navy and not much land strength, as well as hardly any military personnel, Qatar is like a rich man with lots of expensive cars who doesn't know how to drive. Number 8, Bahrain. Bahrain's defense budget for 2017 was about $1.4 billion. In terms of defense imports, in 2015, they amounted to $30 million, but increased to $80 million a year after. This was because of domestic terrorism in the Middle East. That cash was mostly spent on missiles and F-16 maintenance, a whopping total of 17 Fighting Falcons. It also has 180 M60 Patton main battle tanks, but those things, which are also US made, are as old as your granddad. The Navy is tiny and easily the weakest link, with just one frigate and some patrol aircraft. With around 47,000 personnel, it also does not have a big army. Number 7, Lebanon. The Lebanese military is made up of around 116,000 personnel. It's hard to say what the budget is, as so much comes in foreign aid from the US, UK, and Saudi Arabia, the latter of which promised a whopping $3 billion in 2015 and then suspended it. Still, the country has quite a large collection of land artillery, mostly US-made machines that are quite old. The Air Force is weak, but perhaps better than some militaries on this list. It gets freebies too, such as the 2 A-29 Super Tucanos the US donated recently. Besides some patrol craft, there isn't anything in terms of firepower on water. Number 6, Cambodia. Cambodia is a country that has seen its fair share of trials and tribulations over the last few decades. While the economy has been doing better and the country is quickly modernizing, its military is still somewhat in the dark ages. Still, its active and reserve forces number 195,000. Prime Minister Hun Sen has been promising an influx of weapons into the country, and the budget for 2018 is said to be a respectable $542 million. What does this country already own? Not much. No fighter aircraft, no navy, and a lot of old tanks and other artillery. Number 5, Nepal. Nepal's defense budget for 2017 was around $359 million, with 157,000 personnel in its small military. You could say it's kind of the Qatar inverse. The country has no expensive aircraft to brag about and just a few helicopters and transport aircraft. While Nepal has a huge collection of armored fighting vehicles, most of them should be in a museum. There is no navy to speak of, and without access to large bodies of water, it really has no need of one. Number 4, Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan's defense budget for 2017 was about $240 million. The The military is very small in terms of manpower, with just 25,000 personnel, including reserves. The military is mostly made up of what was left when the country was part of the Soviet Union. Kyrgyzstan has around 150 main battle tanks, all Soviet T-72s that have seen better days. But with a fairly large selection of armored fighting vehicles and towed artillery, the army can pack some kind of punch. The Air Force virtually doesn't exist, with just a few helicopters, and the country doesn't have a navy. With its close ties to both Russia and China though, Kyrgyzstan doesn't really need a large fighting force. Number 3. Tajikistan. With just 15,000 military personnel, this military is one of the smallest on our list in terms of numbers. Even those enlisted throughout the years have been known to be disorderly or just make a run for it. There have been reports of soldiers being beaten to death and soldiers committing suicide. Yes, this army is a mess. Its $73 million defense budget won't go too far either. In the air, you have a few helicopters, and in the water, you have nothing at all. We can't really say anything too positive about this outfit. Number 2. Laos. One of the most bombed countries ever, thanks to the US dropping over 2 million bombs on the country in the 60s and 70s, Laos has mostly been the victim of other people's wars. The military has a total of 130,000 personnel, and the budget for 2017 was just $18.5 million. According to the CIA, the military is drastically underfunded. Most of the military is ancient and of Russian origin, while both the Navy and the Air Force don't have any fighting machines. And finally, number 1 on our list of weakest armies in Asia, Bhutan. Bhutan is also a country that doesn't put much emphasis at all on military, though it has far fewer personnel than Laos at around 15,000 active and reserve. But the country doesn't even have those old Russian machines on land, except for a handful of very old armored fighting vehicles. Its air force consists of a couple of helicopters and a couple of transport aircraft, and there is no navy to speak of. You might not even call this a military, and instead call it a security force for any internal struggles in the country. Global Firepower tells us the defense budget is $10 million. Not much you can do with that, but the country has a very good relationship with India if troubles do come. In recent years, China's aggressive expansion of its military presence on disputed South China Sea territories has highlighted for the nation's leadership the necessity for a blue water or ocean-going navy. As the cornerstone of any modern naval force, the Chinese turned their ambition towards developing a homegrown aircraft carrier. Now, nearly a decade after refitting a half-built former Soviet carrier as a test ship, the Chinese have recently put to sea their first indigenous aircraft carrier, the Type 001A. Meanwhile, the USA is simultaneously launching its newest model of aircraft carriers, the Ford class, as it finishes a 3-year pivot of its naval forces to the South Pacific in preparation for a possible confrontation with an increasingly aggressive China. Today, we'll take a look at a potential showdown between two of the mightiest ships ever constructed. In this episode of the Infographic Show, the Chinese Type 001A versus the US Ford-class carrier. To determine a victor, the ships will go head-to-head in 3 key areas: crew, speed/power, and armaments. China's Navy is re-entering blue waters for the first time in over a century and faces a combat-proven United States Navy. But who would win in an all-out fight? A modern aircraft carrier is essentially a small, floating city, housing a crew of thousands who must flawlessly execute dangerous takeoff and landing operations 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in all weather conditions. In combat, crews can potentially be launching and recovering 240 aircraft a day, meaning that this small city must operate in perfect unison at all times. And all the while with hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of live bombs and jet fuel on or below the flight deck. Needless to say, crew expertise is a critical component of any aircraft carrier. The American Ford class is entering service into a navy with a rich aircraft carrier tradition. Both in its own wars and assisting allies or UN forces, the aircraft carrier has been the tip of American power for over 70 years, and its pilots and crews indubitably the most experienced in the world. During the height of carrier-based strikes during the invasions of both Iraq and Afghanistan, American carriers were generating sortie rates of more than 200 a day, an absolutely incredible feat of teamwork and expertise. The Chinese, meanwhile, have only now reached 6 years of aircraft carrier experience. For any new navy, and especially its pilots, the task of operating and launching sorties from a carrier is a difficult and often painful one to master. Landing a 70,000-pound airplane atop a moving deck in the middle of the ocean is an incredibly difficult task for any airman, and Chinese pilots were not only learning how to do this for themselves, but actually designing the training program for future pilots simultaneously. Due to Chinese censorship, exact figures are impossible to verify, but it is clear by the leak of reports of ongoing accidents involving pilots both at sea and testing carrier technologies on dry land that the Chinese are finding the process of cutting their teeth on carrier operations to be as painful as any other nations. Another important factor, however, is the Chinese government's shaky faith in its own troops due to decades of corruption. As he assumed office in 2012, Chinese President Xi Jinping was warned by senior staff that they doubted China's ability to fight and win any war due to the prevalence of corrupt and incompetent military leadership. Xi would immediately launch a series of historic anti-corruption purges, announcing in 2016 that an incredible 1 million officials had been punished for corruption. Western observers note that corruption is still a major concern for Chinese leadership, and also point at a 3 times lowering of military recruitment standards as signs of questionable fitness from its service members. Still, the launching of the Type 001A clearly signals a Chinese Navy that's shaping up and literally shipping out. Shaking off the dark shadow of corruption and boldly stepping forward into its first carrier program, China is still unfortunately overwhelmingly outclassed by America's experience, giving the Ford class the advantage for crew expertise. Our next critical assessment of the two aircraft carriers lies in the area of speed. Aircraft carriers are the vanguards of a nation's naval forces, and as such need to be fast enough to get to hotspots anywhere in the world quickly. Speed isn't just important for getting to war fronts quickly though, but also to make a carrier harder to detect and target. By staying in constant motion, an aircraft carrier is much harder to neutralize than an airfield, but can be just as big a threat. America has a long history of forward deploying its carriers around the world, and thus it's no surprise that speed was a big priority for the US Navy, with the Ford class displacing a whopping 100,000 tons and still reaching speeds in excess of 35 miles per hour. By comparison, the Type 001A is a lithe 70,000 tons and travels at 36 miles per hour. Slight, but the advantage would seemingly still go to the Type 001A, except for the reason why, though it is 30% lighter, the Type 001A is only 1 mile per hour faster than the Ford class. Nuclear power. The US Nimitz class, which the Ford replaces, carries dual nuclear reactors capable of generating a combined 450 megawatts of electricity, but the 40-year-old design is incapable of generating enough power for modern systems. The Ford class was thus designed not only to operate modern power-hungry electronics, but with a projected service life of 90 years, its nuclear reactors can generate up to 700 megawatts, over 25% more than its Nimitz predecessors, and leaving plenty of juice for future weapons and upgrades. Though the Chinese Type 001A is faster by a hair, the Americans once more have the advantage courtesy of the Ford's dual A-1B nuclear reactors and all the modern and future capabilities a Ford carrier can thus bring to bear. Crew, speed, and power are all important for any vessel. But what about the actual weapons both ships bring to bear against one another? Unlike any other combat vessel, an aircraft carrier is unique in that it is equipped with few, if any, long-range strike capabilities in the form of guns or missiles. Instead, they rely completely on the aircraft they launch for both offense and defense. Because our two carriers would never physically see each other in our hypothetical combat, we instead must look at the combat aircraft each brings to bear. China's Type 001A's exact air wing complement remains unconfirmed, as the ship has only now entered sea trials and is yet years away from being operational. Analysts, however, have estimated that the Type 001A will carry either 4 more fixed-wing aircraft or 8 helicopters than the Type 001, bringing its air wing to 24 to 28 fighters and 17 to 25 helicopters. Once operational, the Type 001A will be equipped with the J-15 Flying Shark fighter jet. Denounced by Russia as a copy of their Sukhoi Su-33 fighter, the J-15 is indubitably heavily influenced by the Su-33, but features indigenously developed technologies, an important goal for Chinese military aviation. However, by China's own admission, the J-15's engines are not as powerful as either the Russian Su-33s or the American Super Hornets, requiring the Type 001A carrier to be equipped with a ramp-like ski jump to help get the plane into the air. Its weaker engines and need for a ski ramp for takeoff assist means that the J-15 cannot take off with as much fuel or weapons as an American plane, a critical vulnerability in carrier-on-carrier combat. By comparison, The American Ford class is predicted to field between 75 and 92 aircraft, potentially tripling its combat power versus the Chinese Type 001A. More important, though, is the configuration of the American Air Wing versus the Chinese Air Wing. A Ford-class carrier will be equipped with stealthy F-35s, EA-18G Growler electronic attack jets, MQ-25 Stingray refueling and reconnaissance drones, and E-2D Hawkeye airborne early warning and control aircraft. The addition of electronic attack, airborne refueling, and early warning aircraft to the American Air Wing means that US jets will be able to fly further, for longer, and fire first on radar-jammed and blind Chinese fighters. In the combat calculus of armaments, it is a no-contest win for the United States, who comes armed with triple the firepower and more sophisticated fighter and support aircraft. So who would win in a fight between the Chinese Type 001A and an American Ford-class carrier? The United States brings proven combat veterancy and decades of experience in both operating and building aircraft carriers. Its new Ford-class carriers are not only based on a proven design, but will come equipped with the world's first fifth-generation aircraft and have plenty of capability to adopt emerging technologies such as energy and railgun weapons. While a brave and very impressive start, the Chinese Type 001A is still just that, a start based on an obsolete design for a nation that for decades had no interest in aircraft carriers. Still, some critics argue that the Ford class is too ambitious and fields too many new technologies that have never been tested in combat. Should the worst come to pass, and an American Ford carrier ever finds itself in combat versus China's Type 001A, the victor will almost certainly be the American ship. But who knows? Maybe somewhere deep within the American high-tech carrier lies a critical vulnerability that may spell doom for America's flagships. North Korea and South Korea, two countries that one would think are exactly the same, couldn't be more different from one another. In fact, their politics, economies, and cultures are so vastly different that unification between the North and South seems all but impossible these days. We thought it would be interesting to take a closer look at what would happen if the North and South once again took up arms against one another in this episode of the infographic show, North Korea versus South Korea. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. North Korea may be something of a stranger to the developed world, a country purposefully hidden from the prying eyes of the global media, but one thing it doesn't mind us seeing are glimpses of its military strength. The country might only have a small population of just under 25 million, but it's reported that as of 2016, it has around 1,190,000 active military personnel, 600,000 reserves, and a massive 5,889,000 paramilitary force. This makes the Korean People's Army the largest military force on the planet, employing 7,679,000 people, around a quarter of its population. By comparison, it is 2.5 times bigger than that of the most powerful military in the world, the USA. Size isn't everything though, as we will soon see. Considering North Korea's huge number of able fighters, you might not be surprised to learn that South Korea also has one of the largest military forces. As of 2016, the Republic of Korea Armed Forces consists of around 3,725,000 people from its 51.5 million population. 625,000 are active personnel, and 3,100,000 act as reserves. With a military of such numbers, North Korea has to pump 25% of its $40 billion GDP into its defense budget. South Korea has an estimated $2 trillion GDP, of which $36.8 billion is spent on its military. In terms of where the money goes, North Korea lives up to its epithet of the secretive state, and its military arsenal and nuclear capabilities have been a matter of speculation for some time. According to the Federation of American Scientists in 2017, North Korea has an estimated 10 nuclear warheads. Not many compared to the United States' 6,800, but 10 more than its neighboring southern counterpart. It's said that South Korea has the technology to build nuclear weapons, but has so far chosen not to do so. It's also protected by the USA under what is called a nuclear umbrella. In terms of artillery, the North Korean Army has around 6,600 tanks, 4,100 armored fighting vehicles, 2,250 self-propelled guns, 4,300 towed artillery, and 2,400 multiple launch rocket systems. The South Korean Army has 2,654 tanks, 2,660 AFVs, 1,990 SPGs, 5,374 towed artillery, and 214 MLRSs. With the North's huge army and its bigger artillery, it certainly has the advantage on land. It's also worth noting that unlike its prosperous neighbors, North Korea implements a Songun policy on its population, meaning that military service comes before everything. South Koreans, on the other hand, enjoy a much less battle-minded society. Maybe this is why the Korean Economic Research Institute said in 2011 that the North would have the edge in the early days if a war should break out. Nonetheless, and in spite of the North's air defense artillery, it has a fairly weak air force compared to South Korea. Of its 940 aircraft, its strongest flying machines are somewhat out of date. Its fleet partly consists of around 40 Mikoyan MiG-29 Fulcrums, 105 MiG-23 Floggers, and 35 Sukhoi Su-25 Frogfoots. These planes may have been at the forefront of military aviation in the 70s and 80s, but technologically speaking, they pale in comparison to today's military aircraft. According to the Pentagon, the majority of Pyongyang's arsenal consists of only vintage machines. The Republic of Korea Air Force is far more advanced. It consists of around 1,500 aircraft, much of which is uber-modern compared to its foe. While it's still awaiting an order of 40 F-35 Lightning IIs, possibly the world's most advanced jet fighter designed in the US, it also has a number of F-16 Fighting Falcons, F-15K Strike Eagles, and F-A-50s. Even North Korea's respected anti-aircraft missiles would be hard-pushed to defend the country against such aerial might. In terms of naval power, North Korea has again been accused of being completely out of its depth in terms of technology, with most of its fleet being built in the 50s and 60s. While it has a large number of vessels, they would not be a viable threat if conflict should occur. In total, it has 0 aircraft carriers, 4 frigates, 0 destroyers, 6 corvettes, 78 submarines, 528 coastal defense craft, and 23 mine warfares. South Korea, by contrast, has a modern navy with its own shipbuilding industry said to be at the forefront of maritime design. In total, it has 1 aircraft carrier, 12 frigates, 12 destroyers, 16 corvettes, 15 submarines, 70 coastal defense craft, and 11 mine warfares. When it comes to North versus South in the sea, the general conclusion is we should look at quality, not quantity, with most critics stating the technology of both sides is hardly even comparable. A battle must also be fueled, and here both North Korea and South Korea lack the oil for any kind of protracted conflict. The North produces around 100 barrels of oil per day and consumes around 15,000 barrels a day. It has no oil reserves. The South produces around 500 barrels a day, consumes 2,325,000 barrels daily, and also has no proven oil reserves. It's debatable if any country would come to the aid of North Korea if a war should break out with South Korea. The South, on the other hand, has the advantage of the US as an ally, with 30,000 US troops already stationed in South Korea. It's thought that while North Korea's land advantage might get them off to a good start, it would only be a matter of time until the South and its allies took out anti-aircraft missile sites, command and control centers, its land artillery, and finally the country's infrastructure. If the North decided to use its nuclear arsenal, there are 2 things that could happen. Either its population would be decimated by US nuclear missiles, or its nuclear weapons would be captured in a land invasion. Given the vast and deadly consequences of the former, it's likely the latter would be the best option. Ultimately, North Korea, even with its huge number of personnel and some say exaggerated weapons programs, would be no match for South Korea and its main ally, the USA. Such a conflict would be devastating, however, and it's one the world does not want to see. The European Union is presently an economic powerhouse consisting of 28 countries with a combined GDP of nearly $19 trillion. About 1.5% of that amount is spent on its defense, totaling a whopping $226 billion. This massive number is still substantially smaller than the $664 billion the United States spends on defense. But it's Russia we'll be focusing on today, the world's second largest military. With a GDP of $1.9 trillion, Russia spends $47 billion on its defense budget. Our question today is how would the EU with its 28 different countries fare if it went up against the well-equipped, military-minded country of Russia? Let's take a look at this hypothetical matchup in this episode of the infographic show, the European Union versus Russia. This episode was made possible thanks to our wonderful friends at Easily. Give Easily a try for creating amazing infographics. It's easy and free. The first thing we should point out is that while Russia is indisputably the world's most powerful military behind the US, the UK, France, Germany, and Italy are all considered military powerhouses in themselves, and each country is a European Union member. The UK may have just Brexited, but the divorce from the EU won't be final until March 2019. Right now, the EU has a population of 508 million people, 1.4 million of whom are active military personnel. It also has another 1.7 million people acting as reserves. In terms of manpower, Russia isn't far behind. While its population is a shade of the EU's at 143 million, 2.5 million of Russia's citizens are reserve personnel, with 766,000 currently signed up for active military service. As far as weaponry is concerned, we should broach the not-so-pleasant subject of an all-out nuclear war and the all-but-assured ensuing apocalypse. In the case of such a disaster, Russia is the bigger foe, with a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons. It's also worth pointing out that the US is an ally of Europe, and it has an even bigger arsenal of these megabombs. If we get down to the numbers, Russia reportedly has 1,920 deployed warheads, meaning the missiles are good to go. It has another 5,380 warheads waiting in the wings or ready for dismantlement. The EU has a very small slice of the nuclear pie, with the UK and France being the only proprietors of nuclear weapons in Europe. The UK has 160 deployed warheads, 65 in reserve, while France has 290 deployed warheads and 10 in reserve. All the nukes in the world couldn't destroy humanity through blast force alone, but millions could die, certainly decimating the populations of Europe and Russia. It's thought the biggest of nuclear bombs, Russia's Tsar Bomba, if dropped on a densely populated city such as New York, could kill as many as 7.6 million people on impact. But if Russia and the EU did get into a nuclear war, the eventual radiation fallout and blocking out of the sun would cause massive illness and death, and also ecosystem destruction. Russia versus Europe nuclear war ends in a draw. Both sides lose. On a lighter note, let's have a look at both sides' less destructive weapons. In terms of land weapons, the EU has 6,700 tanks, 48,971 armored fighting vehicles, 2,312 self-propelled guns, 3,492 towed artillery, and 1,069 multiple launch rocket systems. Russia has some supremacy here with its 15,400 tanks, 31,300 AFVs, 5,972 SPGs, 4,625 towed artillery, and 3,793 MLRSs. Who has the best tank is a debate in itself, but here each side holds up pretty well. Russia mounts a serious challenge with its T-90S and its new super tank, the next generation T-14 Armata. Europe is no slouch though when it comes to tanks. Highly rated in the best of these armored beasts list is Germany's Army Leopard 2A5, the UK's Challenger 2, and France's Leclerc. In the air, again there's compelling evidence that each side would hold its own if a war should break out. Russia has 3,100 aircraft, including its deadly multi-role fighter, the Sukhoi Su-35, as well as its interceptor, the MiG-31. Europe has a much bigger air force with 6,751 aircraft and a handful of leading fighter jets. The EU's ace in the hand here is probably the Eurofighter Typhoon, a feat of engineering that was a collaborative effort from UK, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. France's Omni-Role jet fighter, the Dassault Rafale, is also highly rated. While Britannia Great Britain may have boasted throughout late history that it rules the waves, that may not be the case these days. Britain's Royal Navy is said to be one of the best, but it's still thought to be less powerful than the Russian Navy. Combining Europe, though, makes all the difference, not only in engineering skills but also sheer numbers. The EU has a total of 61 submarines, 102 frigates, 21 destroyers, 39 corvettes, 167 mine warfare craft, 210 patrol craft, and 4 aircraft carriers. Russia has a total of 60 submarines, 4 frigates, 15 destroyers, 81 corvettes, 45 mine warfare craft, 14 patrol craft, and only 1 aircraft carrier. If we reflect on those numbers, we might come to the conclusion that indeed Britannia no longer rules the waves, but the EU could certainly challenge any superpower in the sea. To power these massive militaries takes a lot of oil, certainly if the war was a protracted one. Here the EU is lacking as it only produces about 1.7 million barrels of oil a day while consuming much more than that amount. It's also got around 5.6 billion barrels of oil in reserve. Russia significantly has the upper hand, producing 10 million barrels daily and consuming only 3.3 million barrels a day. It has a huge 80 billion barrel oil reserve. There's little doubt, however, that if this hypothetical war did happen, the world's largest military, the USA, would have the back of the EU. This would change matters considerably. There is also the issue of each country's technological capabilities. Throughout 2 world wars, Germany and the UK developed a technology which sparked the computer age. Europe and its allies are currently developing automatized military systems, complex spying technologies, drone technology, and perhaps not too far from now, soldiers of war that are not human, but robots. We can presently assume that the EU, with the US on side, is ahead in terms of computer technology, but Russia, possibly with China on side, would not be too far behind. As has been demonstrated in numerous documentaries, the Internet of Things could change how wars are fought. Weapons with machine learning artificial intelligence may also change the landscape of destruction. At the same time, if you can hack a nuclear missile launching system, it's probably game over for the other side. As for allies, Russia doesn't have too many. It's been said Russia has only a handful of allies and nothing compared to the friendships the EU could call upon in times of need. Other things to consider might be military experience, of which the EU could be said to have the upper hand as a collective. Nonetheless, being a collective could pose its own kind of communication problems and disagreements. Russia will never fall out with itself, while most of Europe has a history of squabbling.
In the year 2020, the US is still the world's sole superpower, but China is not far behind. Both nations have huge amounts of influence across the globe and economies that generate enormous wealth. But what about their militaries? If China and the United States were to go to war, who would have the advantage? In this military comparison, we're pitting China's People's Liberation Army against the United States military to see how they match up. After we lay out the capabilities of each, we'll decide who will win in an all-out war. Bear in mind that both of these militaries are always changing, so it's important to keep an eye on the future. In the end, it'll all come down to which country has the stronger and smarter military. Let's see if you come to the same conclusion we do, of who would win in a war between China and the United States of America. In terms of resources, China and the US are both well equipped to support their militaries during the war. It's well known that the United States spends more money than any other country on its military. The most recent military budget for the United States was around $721 billion. That's more than many countries' entire GDP. On the other hand, China's military budget is around $178 billion. Notice the huge contrast between the two nations' military spending. Just in pure spending, the United States beats China. But just because a country spends a lot of money does not mean they have the better military equipment or personnel. Although the United States invests more money in their military, China leads with a different resource: manpower. If all-out war happened, the ability to manufacture weapons and replenish casualties would be vital. The current population of the United States is just over 330 million people. The population of China, around 1.5 billion people. Of course, not everyone in each population would be able to fight or work in factories, but just in terms of people, China vastly outnumbers the US. This brings us to the active number of military personnel in each country. Who has the bigger military? Well, it should come as no surprise that the number of soldiers in China's military is much larger than the United States. With more people in the country, there are more people in the military. In fact, the number of military personnel in China is almost double the amount of military personnel in the United States. The US military consists of around 1.3 million personnel on active duty. The People's Liberation Army has just over 2 million military personnel. If war broke out between the two countries, the United States would need to immediately reinstate the draft, just to come close to matching the number of military personnel the People's Liberation Army currently has. Due to the immense size of the Pacific Ocean, a war between China and the US would most likely not start on land. So let's first look at the Air Force capabilities of each nation and how they stack up against one another. The total number of military aircraft the United States has is around 5,370. China's Air Force contains about 3,010 planes, but these numbers are always fluctuating as new planes are built and old aircraft are retired. Right now, the Chinese military is building and purchasing aircraft much faster than the US. It's estimated that in a few years, the number of aircraft between the two nations will be comparable. But what about the types of aircraft? Which country has better fighter planes, bombers, and transports? The United States has a vast array of aircraft at their disposal, the most impressive of which are the F-35 Lightning, F-22 Raptor, and F-15 Eagle. These fighter jets help the US maintain air superiority. However, China has its own stealth fighter in the J-20, although it's only available in extremely low numbers and is generally considered a poor man's version of the American F-35. In the air, the American military still retains a lethal advantage over the Chinese military with more sophisticated avionics, a much larger fleet of fifth-generation aircraft, and a far greater number of support aircraft such as tankers and AWACS platforms. American pilots also train on average 20 to 30 hours more per year than their Chinese counterparts, and in more realistic scenarios than the Chinese. As we look at other aspects of the Air Force in each country, we find that larger aircraft such as bombers and transports are not equal. The United States has a clear advantage. There are two reasons for this. The first is because the US just has more aircraft. The second reason is because a lot of money being pumped into the United States military goes to research and development each year. The United States aircrafts are up to date, while the Chinese Air Force is still working with functional but older models. You don't need to look much further than the United States' Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, Northrop B-2 Spirit, and Rockwell B-1 Lancer to show that in terms of dominating ground targets from the air, the US has the advantage. Other than the skies, the next most important military technology in a war between China and the US would be the Navy. Controlling the oceans in this conflict would be vital for success. One of the most important ships in a naval arsenal would be the aircraft carrier. The floating fortresses would be crucial to launching airstrikes on the opposing country. Currently, the United States is the world leader in aircraft carriers. The US has 11 active aircraft carriers, while China only has 2, and only one of those is currently rated as combat ready. This clearly puts dominance of the ocean in favor of the United States military. But what about other warships? If China could destroy the US aircraft carriers, would they have the advantage? The United States currently has around 430 naval ships on active and reserve duty. However, only about 300 of those ships are currently able to deploy at a moment's notice. If war broke out between China and the United States right now, China would have a fleet of 335 ships to call upon. But just like the case for the US, not every ship would be available for combat, with about 20% on each side being currently undergoing maintenance, retrofit, or rest and relaxation for its crews. Without eliminating the US's aircraft carrier fleet, China would stand no chance of victory in the Pacific if all-out conflict took place. Yet even with American carriers out of action, China would be extremely hard-pressed to deal with the American submarine fleet. While it has its own fleet of 74 subs versus the US's 66, China severely lacks in anti-submarine warfare assets and would be ill-equipped to take on America's silent service. On the American side, a disastrous performance by its own anti-submarine warfare assets during exercises in the early 2000s revealed a terrible crumbling of the American Navy's capability to wage anti-submarine warfare after the end of the Cold War. Since then, and with the help of ultra-silent diesel submarines from partner nations, the US has undertaken great steps to once again bolster its ASW capabilities and is believed to be well prepared to face any enemy fleet as the world prepares for great power competitions once again. For now, the US fleet remains supreme, but it's divided between responsibilities around the world, while China can focus the entirety of its efforts in fighting America's Pacific Fleet alone. With a rapidly modernizing fleet and more sophisticated shipbuilding efforts, China looks set to close the gap between itself and the US in the approaching decades. What would happen if the war made its way to land, though? Obviously, it would depend on where the war was being fought. The nation battling on their home turf would ultimately have the advantage because of their ability to replenish land forces more easily. Let's take location out of the equation and just compare the land-based military capabilities of each nation. We know that in terms of soldiers, China outnumbers the US. We also know that if soldier numbers need to be replenished, there are many more people to choose from in China than in the US. Basically, if the two countries went to war using only soldiers, the United States would eventually succumb to the large number of available manpower China has. That being said, this is not how wars are fought anymore. Instead, land battles can be won using machinery, such as tanks. The United States has a tank arsenal of around 8,010 vehicles. The US's main battle tank is the legendary M1 Abrams, of which not a single one has been lost to enemy action yet. If deployed, the United States tank army would be a devastating force. It would plow through anything in its path. China has fewer tanks at around 6,560, and just under half of those are first-generation tanks dating back to the early Cold War era. Around 2,360 of the Chinese tanks are Type 59s. These tanks were produced in the 50s and 60s. They're antiquated and currently retired, but still kept in reserve. This means that the tank force of China is actually much smaller than the United States'. The US pours billions of dollars into upgrading their tanks with state-of-the-art equipment and keeping their forces modernized. Clearly, the United States would decimate China in a tank battle. In today's day and age, battles are rarely fought only on the ground. At some point, they may not even be fought on the planet. Recently, the United States has implemented a new branch of the military, Space Force. Space Force's missions is to organize, train, and equip space forces in order to protect US and allied interests in space and to provide space capabilities to the Joint Force. It is clear that the United States is moving toward militarizing this new horizon. But is China? Recent reports have shown that China has been rapidly expanding its space program. They were the third country to launch a human into space behind the former Soviet Union, now Russia, and the United States. China completed this feat back in 2003 and has since ramped up their space program. They are the first and only country to put a rover on the far side of the moon, where they've made several discoveries. China has also been launching more and more satellites and military spacecraft into space in recent years. It's estimated that China has more than 320 satellites. 105 of them are military in nature. The United States has around 123 military satellites, even though the US has been in space much longer than China. It would seem that the breakthroughs at the China National Space Administration have greatly sped up the military satellite capabilities of the country. The budget for NASA in the United States has been cut year after year, almost immediately after they put the first man on the moon. China's space program, on the other hand, seems to be getting an influx of money each year from the government. How long until the research and development of China's engineers and space scientists surpass the US? In space, the country with the best technology and most knowledge of the environment will be victorious in battle. If the United States continues to fall behind in space exploration, they will not stand a chance in the space war with China. This brings us to our last comparison between the two countries, a comparison that has no winner. Instead, everyone loses. We're talking about nuclear weapons. As of right now, China has an estimated total of 320 nuclear warheads. That might seem like a lot, but it is nothing compared to the amount of nuclear weapons the United States has stockpiled. The United States has about 6,370 nuclear warheads under its control. 2,000 of those nukes are awaiting to be dismantled and disposed of. However, if nuclear war broke out between China and the US, neither country would get a chance to use all their nuclear weapons. The human race would be annihilated long before then. So, it's probably in China's and the United States' and the entire world's best interest that nuclear war never comes. Although the United States has a slight military advantage over China, we can't underestimate how far China's military has come in a relatively short amount of time. Also, the vast amount of manpower could be enough to allow China to hold out for a long time, slowly depleting the United States' resources. However, the reason we believe that the United States would win a war with China is because of experience. The United States has a lot more military experience than China. This means that the leaders of the military have seen combat and know what works and what doesn't. The US has been at war almost perpetually in one form or another since World War II, most recently in the Middle East. Since the beginning of Desert Storm in 1991, the United States has maintained a military presence in the Middle East. In fact, the United States has been fighting in Afghanistan for almost 18 years. This means military personnel and leaders have constantly been gaining skills and experience in the art of war. China, on the other hand, has not fought in a war in over 40 years. The last war they fought in was in 1979 when China invaded Vietnam. Vietnam had just come out of its own civil war and had gained much experience during that time. The small country was able to humiliate the Chinese military, forcing them out of their country after only 3 weeks. It seems that experience can outweigh sheer numbers during wartime. It is for this reason that we believe the United States would win a war with China if it were fought today. However, and some of you might have already seen this coming, if China continues to expand and upgrade their military as they've been doing in recent years, it will not be long before their military strength surpasses the United States. If this happens, it's a very real possibility that China would win a war against the United States in the future. Their drive to update their machinery and technology can be seen in their space program and the expansion of their military. Within the next decade, we at the Infographic Show may need to make a new video to reevaluate this military comparison between China and the United States, with the winner being the People's Liberation Army of China.
This is an all-new kind of military comparison because we are not matching a pair of nations, but rather 2 against 1. According to Business Insider in 2018, this triumvirate of nations has the most powerful militaries in the entire world, putting the USA in first, Russia in second, and China in third. Following these 3 countries are India, France, and the UK. Now, we already know that the USA spends more on its military than any other country, something not all Americans are very happy about, but we also know that Russia has had a powerful military for many years and that China has more recently started to spend big. So, what would happen if they teamed up against the US? That's what we'll find out. In this episode of the Infographic Show, USA versus China and Russia, who would win? The USA spends more on defense than the next 9 countries in total, which is some feat. When you look at the sources for the military base budget, most say it's somewhere between $587 billion and $597 billion. Nonetheless, the website The Balance goes a step further and adds the expenses of other agencies that come under the defense umbrella, and it states that the budget is actually $886 billion. We can't itemize this bill, as it would take an entire show, but most of the money goes on the actual running of the military. However, and this is a huge part, the website states the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program cost $400 billion for 2,457 planes, mostly for development and testing. Those F-35s sure are expensive, especially when you consider that the Department of Education got only $59 billion last year. What about China and Russia? As for Russia's budget, again it depends on what source you are reading. Fortune in 2017 called Russia's military leaner but meaner, stating that its budget had decreased to just $42.3 billion. Other sources say it's more like $46 billion. That isn't much compared to the USA, but we'll see how that money was spent soon. China's defense budget, and most sources agree, for 2018 is $174.5 billion. Okay, so the USA has the highest GDP in the world at $19.4 trillion, according to the International Monetary Fund. China was next at $12 trillion, and Russia was in 12th at $1.53 trillion. What we can say is that it's obvious why Russia is spending much less than the USA, but China, if it wanted to, could perhaps spend a little more. Percentage-wise, the USA spends a fair bit more than China on military when the budget is divided by GDP. Still, in terms of spending power, the USA is stronger than both countries, and in terms of military spending, it spends about 4 times more than both China and Russia combined. But what do we get for the money? One website dedicates its time to adding up how many people and how much machinery each country has. As for the USA, in terms of feet on the ground, it has a total of 2,083,100 personnel, 1,281,900 work as active personnel, and 801,200 are reserves. Here we can guess the USA will fall behind. Russia has a total of 3,586,128 military personnel, 1,013,628 are active personnel, and 2,572,500 are reserves. China has a total of 2,693,000 military personnel, 2,183,000 are active personnel, and 510,000 are reserves. What this means is that Russia and China together have about a 3 times larger military in terms of manpower than the USA. When it comes to people needed to fight, one thing to bear in mind is training, but when it comes to war, one of the things you have to think about is who would fight and sacrifice themselves. Perhaps the most war-torn nation is Russia, having suffered in the world wars so much. But then the US has been at war or secretly involved in military operations almost since the Second World War. China's military is largely untested, but one should ask if China's regime would be better able than the US government at summoning its people to fight. We might also ask if those many in the USA who have grown used to relatively more creature comforts would even join a war, or would they even protest against one? As we say, there's no easy way to understand this. We can only speculate. Let's now have a look at what each country has in terms of machines that travel on land. The USA has in total 5,884 battle tanks, 38,822 armored fighting vehicles, 950 self-propelled artillery, 795 towed artillery, and 1,197 rocket projectors. Russia has 20,300 battle tanks, 27,400 armored fighting vehicles, 5,970 self-propelled artillery, 4,466 towed artillery, and 3,816 rocket projectors. China has 7,716 battle tanks, 9,000 armored fighting vehicles, 2,000 self-propelled artillery, 6,246 towed artillery, and 2,050 rocket projectors. As you can see, the USA has far fewer machines here, but it does have the M1 Abrams tank, which is regarded as one of the best in the world. Much of Russia's fleet is old, but its T-90 is good, and its newer Armata super tank is also regarded as a mean machine and perhaps the best in the world. But as National Interest pointed out in 2018, the country may not have enough money to produce many of them. That's the big difference. The USA has tons of budget to produce many more tanks if need be. National Interest also points out that most of China's tank fleet is old, but hastens to say that China's Type 99 can hold its weight with any of Russia's or America's tanks. You have to give Russia and China the advantage here. But where the USA is strongest is in the air, with no other country coming near its outrageously powerful fleet of aircraft. We already know about all those F-35s in development, but the USA also has a large fleet of other great aircraft, including F-22 Raptors, F-15E Strike Eagles, FA-18EF Super Hornets, and F-16 Fighting Falcons. This year, it bought 15 KC-46 Tanker Strategic Military Transport aircrafts for $3.1 billion, and also one B-21 bomber for $2 billion. We might also wonder what's going on with stealth aircraft at that secretive place called Area 51. Still, Russia has hundreds of Sukhoi Su-35s, and no one has ever doubted this aircraft is as good as any that exist. As backup, it has fleets of MiG-29s, Su-27s, and MiG-31s. Looking at the future and 5th generation aircraft, Russia is quietly building the Sukhoi T-50 PAK-FA, which national interest said is as good as anything out there, while the airplane Russia calls the Ghost, the Su-57 stealth fighter, is currently under development. China is no slouch either, with its ready-for-battle Chengdu J-10s and J-20s. You'll find all of these aircraft we've mentioned on top 10 lists, with pundits not always agreeing on which takes first place. All we can say is that the US has more cash to build more, and perhaps a more experienced Air Force. As for the Navy, the US holds an ace in the hole with its large fleet of 20 strong aircraft carriers, expensive things but extremely important in war. The biggest and perhaps best of its kind is the USA's Gerald R. Ford, and the US also has 2 super carriers under construction and 10 more planned, which will cost many billions of dollars. China has just 2 aircraft carriers, but is building a super carrier called the Type 002. Russia has 1 fairly old aircraft carrier, not quite up to speed with China and America. The US also has 10 frigates, 65 destroyers, so more to come this year, 0 corvettes, 66 submarines, 13 patrol craft, and 11 mine warfare vessels. China has 50 frigates, 29 destroyers, 39 corvettes, 73 submarines, 220 patrol craft, and 29 mine warfare vessels. Russia has 9 frigates, 13 destroyers, 78 corvettes, 62 submarines, 41 patrol craft, and 47 mine warfare vessels. Not surprisingly, if you look at any top 10 lists, the best navies in the world usually go something like 3rd Russia, 2nd China, and 1st USA. Only global firepower puts China ahead of the USA, but it's only adding up the number of vessels. Still, you can find articles on the web stating that China is catching up to the USA, so if we add Russia to China, well, that's a formidable force. We could talk about nuclear weapons, but we all know most of those are split between Russia and the USA. China has some, but no one knows how many exactly. We could also wonder if any country could prevent any missiles hitting in the event of a nuclear war, but it's likely it would just mean all-out destruction. So, in terms of who would win this hypothetical matchup, and let's say the USA didn't have any allies, such as its favorite big brother the UK, we'd have to say Russia and China. The USA may have the money, but both China and Russia are developing all kinds of new weapons to match any weapons in the US. On top of that, you just have so much more manpower. It would, in the end, overwhelm the USA. The 2 countries we're going to talk about today are seldom off the front pages of the international news media. As we write this, a news report tells us Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is saying Iran is waging a religious war in Syria and that the country has its sights set on attacking Israel. Iran calls for our destruction, but it's also seeking nuclear weapons to carry out its genocidal designs, said the Prime Minister. Meanwhile, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict must be one of the most divisive issues out there, with much of the press and public painting Israel as the villain. We won't get into the politics of it all, but with these countries being on everyone's mind, we thought we'd match them up militarily. Without further ado, welcome to this episode of the infographic show, Iran versus Israel. Let's start with the money. Israel's defense budget for 2018 was reported as being $20 billion, which includes the yearly stipend the country gets from the USA, approximately $3.8 billion. We might also add that the Israeli defense minister is asking for another $1.4 billion to fund a military that is constantly in action. Here we will also add that Israel is to some extent under the protection of the United States, but today we'll be focusing on Israel's military alone and not its power when its ever-faithful big brother steps in to assist. Iran's military budget is considerably lower than Israel's, reported as $14.1 billion for 2017. Although, a Forbes article in 2018 said things are about to change, and perhaps that's why traditional military sites are not reporting the 2018 budget. Forbes writes that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, part of Iran's armed forces designed to protect the Islamic Republic, is due for a massive injection of cash. The IRGC will receive $8 billion from Iran's fiscal budget, writes Forbes, adding that Iran plans to spend large, even if that poses a threat to the welfare of its citizens. Forbes says Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security will get $1 billion, and it seems the rest will go to the traditional military. If this increased spending happens, then Iran will have more to spend than Israel, but not by much. As for people on the ground, Israel has 615,000 military personnel. 170,000 are active personnel, and 445,000 are reserves. Add to that Israel's Shayetet 13, a special operations outfit said to be one of the best. As we said in our last show, something to bear in mind is conscription in Israel. Most Israelis, when they reach 18 years old, will become part of the military. Service time is 2 years, 8 months for men, and 2 years for women. We must remember, this means Israel has a hell of a lot of young people already trained to fight or that have actually been involved in warfare. It's not all action, of course, with some jobs being just hanging out as a safety precaution on one of Israel's many kibbutzim. Iran has a bigger force though, with a total of 934,000 military personnel, 534,000 are active personnel, and 400,000 are reserves. Iran also has conscription, but it's only applicable to men. That means once Iranians reach the age of 18, they must do somewhere between 18 months and 2 years in the military. We might also point out that while women are not conscripted, some do volunteer. Iran also has its special forces, from the Marines to its elite Quds force, and the Sabarin Takovar Battalion, a special unit of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Okay, so what about equipment on the ground? Israel has a fairly modern and well-maintained bunch of machines. This includes 2,760 battle tanks, 10,575 armored fighting vehicles, 650 self-propelled artillery, 300 towed artillery, and 148 rocket projectors. We might add that part of this is the Merkava 4 main battle tank, which National Interest said in 2017 just might be the best in the world. We might add that National Interest says this about many tanks. What about Iran's tools of the trade? Well, the country owns 1,650 battle tanks, 2,215 armored fighting vehicles, 440 self-propelled artillery, 2,188 towed artillery, and 1,533 rocket projectors. As for tanks, National Interest talked about an Iranian tank that was, you guessed it, one of the best in the world. This is the Karar tank, which was made in Iran and is supposed to be superior to the Russian-made T-90. Iran has a number of older tanks that were made in the USA, the UK, and Russia. We might remember that Iran and the US used to be friends in the past, with the US actually helping Iran to kick off its nuclear program in the 50s. This assistance became known as Atoms of Peace, and yes, that was a term before it became the name of a band started by Radiohead lead singer Tom York. We point this out only to let you know how fickle relationships can be, and so you never know, maybe one day Israel might not be a demi-protectorate of the US. Compared to its land artillery, Israel's air force is quite small. It has 252 fighter aircraft and 252 attack aircraft. Israel has also spent big on 9 F-35s bought from the US and also has over 70 F-16 Fighting Falcons. On top of that, they have F-15 Eagles and F-15 Strike Eagles. So, while small, there isn't much there that hasn't at one point been said to be a top 10 aircraft. Iran has an even smaller fleet with 150 fighter aircraft and 158 attack aircraft. Some of those were the ones given as a gift from the USA in a small fleet F-14 Tomcat fighters. Add to that some rather old American-made multi-role fighters in the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II and Northrop F-5 Tiger II. Perhaps the best aircraft Iran has is the Russian-made Mikoyan MiG-29 Fulcrum, as well as Russian Sukhoi Su-24s and 25s. In the water, neither country is very strong, with Israel having no aircraft carriers and not much of anything else. In total, the country owns no frigates, no destroyers, 3 corvettes, 6 submarines, 32 patrol craft, and 0 mine warfare vessels. Iran has more to brag about, having a total of no destroyers, 5 frigates, 3 corvettes, 33 submarines, 230 patrol craft, and 10 mine warfare vessels. In numbers, this is at least far stronger than Israel. As for nuclear weapons, we will use a quote we have used before regarding Israel, written in 2017 in National Interest. It says about all you need to know. Israel does not confirm nor deny having nuclear weapons. Experts generally assess the country as currently having approximately 80 nuclear weapons. What about Iran? Well, that's the million-dollar question. CNN wrote this in 2018. Iran does not yet have a nuclear weapon, but does have enough low-enriched uranium for a single nuclear weapon. Then we had a report on June 4th in the British tabloid The Sun that stated Israel intelligence agency Mossad had discovered documents in a warehouse in Tehran that suggested Iran was on its way to making nuclear weapons. Depending on what news source you read, Iran has them already, will have them soon, or has some good to go, but in North Korea. The truth is out there, but we won't say we know what it is. So, who wins? Well, we have to give the edge to Iran. It's just a bigger military in the end. We're not alone. Other pundits, it seems, also give Iran the edge, stating that the country falls just outside of the top 10 most powerful militaries in the world. Today we're pitting the American soldier head-to-head versus the Russian soldier and looking at the different capabilities, training, and equipment that each brings to bear. With tensions starting to heat up between the two former Cold War superpower adversaries, what would a showdown between East and West actually look like from the average soldier's perspective, and who would fare best in a war that would surely be more catastrophic than both world wars put together? First though, let's take a look at the background and recent history of both nations' armed forces. Though no longer the juggernaut that threatened Western Europe with its endless hordes of armored battle tanks, Russia still retains a formidable military. Unlike most nations on Earth, and perhaps with its rival America being the only other exception, Russian troops have faced ongoing combat action since the end of World War II, albeit at a much lower intensity than the United States. The largest conflict in modern times that Russia engaged in was the invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979. Acting in support of a communist Afghan government, the Soviet Union soon found itself in a similar quagmire as the United States in its own invasion decades later. Ultimately a strategic failure, the Soviet Union finally pulled out of the country almost 10 years later in February of 1989. The United States, by comparison, has been involved in high-intensity combat action nearly every decade since the end of World War II. From Korea to Vietnam, Grenada, Iraq, and then the double invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, America has fought wars in nearly every climate and continent on Earth. Ultimately, though, it would be the US's own invasion of Afghanistan that would best highlight the key differences in American and Russian combat doctrine and capabilities. When Soviet troops entered Afghanistan, they did so much like America, with overwhelming force spearheaded by columns of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, overwatched by tremendous air support. Also like America, the initial Soviet invasion saw little resistance from the Afghan Mujahideen, who could not hope to match Soviet military power on a one-on-one basis. Much like the United States, Soviet troops had been trained to fight a conventional war against a conventional enemy, NATO, where enemy soldiers were clearly identifiable by their uniforms and battle lines clearly drawn across each side. The Mujahideen would exploit this Soviet war-fighting doctrine by instead fighting a guerrilla or asymmetric war, wherein they would launch lightning raids before retreating into the countryside or melting into the local population, thus denying the Russians a chance to bring their formidable firepower to bear on any discernible enemy. Exactly like America's own war 2 decades later, each element of the Soviet armed forces would come into play, but the bulk of the war effort would be executed by small groups of soldiers. The small unit action nature of both the American and the Russian-Afghan war thus gives us the best comparison point for the two nations' infantry forces. So how well exactly did each nation's soldiers perform? Both nations entered the guerrilla war phase of their Afghan campaigns at major disadvantages. Russian and American infantrymen had both trained for decades to face each other on European battlefields, and thus each nation's infantry were primarily trained in mass unit tactics and combined arms warfare, wherein they would work in collusion with other ground, air, and fire support elements. Trained to defeat columns of armored tanks and hordes of enemy infantry, the intimate door-to-door nature of both nations' Afghan war proved a steep learning curve. The very first and greatest weakness exploited by the Afghan Mujahideen was both nations' lack of training and experience in close quarters combat. During the Afghan-Soviet War, Russian infantrymen became notorious for their extremely poor performance once the enemy closed into within 50 meters, once even breaking and retreating when a token force of Mujahideen surprised a superior Russian force by popping up from sewer tunnels within mere meters of their position. Just a few years into the war, Russia's performance in close quarters was so poor that troops were mostly kept in fortified garrisons and would rarely engage in routine security patrols. American troops would initially face the same challenges, with similar poor performance. While poor Russian performance was due to a variety of reasons, such as low morale, unwilling conscripts forced to fight, and varying quality of training, American troops instead became a casualty of their own superiority. With unmatched air and ground-based fire support, American infantry had become accustomed to hunkering down when engaged and calling in for overwhelming fire support to destroy the enemy, a luxury that Russian troops did not always enjoy. However, faced with a door-to-door war and an enemy that struck from amidst the civilian population, the Americans were forced to forego their fire support advantages and would have to fight soldier to soldier like their Soviet counterparts had 2 decades prior. During the first 2 years of the war, this proved to be a very painful lesson. However, within the first 6 months of the invasion, American basic training and infantryman training programs had already begun to incorporate CQB, or Close Quarters Battle Training. Within years, the United States had completely revamped its training programs and began fielding an infantry force with great expertise in door-to-door urban combat. Though other factors, such as technology and more advanced equipment, would play a role in minimizing US casualties versus their Soviet counterparts, it is American flexibility that would ultimately see them perform far better than the Soviet Union soldiers had decades earlier. Not only did the United States exhibit greater flexibility in its national training structure, but this adaptability has for a long time been a hallmark of American warfighting doctrine. Unlike their Russian counterparts, who were trained to obey orders from very much a top-down command structure, US troops have for a long time been encouraged to act with a degree of autonomy, allowing small unit commanders with on-the-ground situational awareness to make command decisions that a Russian unit would need much higher authority for. This allows American troops to react much more quickly to the chaos of war, and though the US and Russia have thankfully never faced each other in combat, the difference between the two military doctrines was shockingly clear in the first American invasion of Iraq in 1990. Following a rigid, Russian-style top-down command structure, Iraqi forces, who at the time commanded one of the world's largest and most formidable militaries, were utterly decimated by a fast-acting American-led invasion that outpaced Iraqi military leadership's ability to relay orders in a timely manner to troops that needed them. But what about the capabilities of each nation's individual soldier? On a strictly one-on-one comparison, how does each nation's infantryman stack up against the other? The best place to start is by looking at the primary armament of each soldier. Though modernizing to a new battle rifle, the bulk of Russian ground forces still utilize the tried and true AK-47. Called the greatest rifle ever made, the AK-47's legendary fame is not without merit. Seeing action in nearly every battlefield around the world since its invention in 1949, the AK-47 has proven reliable in every environmental condition possible. Firing a 7.62mm round at 715 meters per second, the AK-47 has major stopping power and penetration both, and is easily capable of the much vaunted first contact kill, or ability to neutralize an enemy with the first round on target. By comparison, the United States fields the M4 carbine, a rifle that many, even within the US Armed Forces themselves, have for a long time considered inferior to the Russian AK. An evolution of the American M16, it is also a reliable and proven rifle, but suffers from a lower mass bullet as it utilizes the smaller 5.56mm round. While this lighter bullet gives the M4 greater accuracy at greater range than the AK-47, it has been very loudly criticized for lacking in stopping power. In fact, one of the greatest complaints about its performance in the recent Iraq-Afghan war was that it would take multiple hits on target to neutralize an enemy, with the lighter round propelled at a whopping 910 meters per second, often zipping straight through an unarmored opponent and leaving little physical damage behind. This criticism has plagued the M4 nearly since inception, and many American servicemen lament that the one area the US military has always lagged behind their Russian counterparts in is the main battle rifle. Though the American M4 affords greater range and accuracy, in today's urban door-to-door wars, it is the Russian AK-47 that has a clear advantage. Yet history has proven that it is the men and not the weapons that win wars. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian forces have suffered from long years of neglect, while American forces have continued to build on their hard-earned battlefield expertise, adding to a rich tradition of proficient warfighters. Yet Russia is a nation that has faced annihilation repeatedly throughout its troubled history at the hands of superior foes, and has emerged battered, bloodied, but triumphant from each challenge.
With tensions skyrocketing in Ukraine, a confrontation between the United States and Russia is more likely than ever. But what would that look like, and how do these two military heavyweights compare? If Russia and the US come to blows, anyone caught in their way better make sure not to get underfoot of these two military titans. The US remains the world's premier military superpower, but Russia holds fast to the number 2 spot, just barely edging out over China's rising star. In Russia, crippling sanctions over the annexation of Crimea have bled Russia dry for almost a decade and been an absolute economic disaster for the nation. Not only is the Russian economy critically weakened, but sanctions and stagnation have led to a slow but steady brain drain of Russian talent out of the country. Russian professionals, entrepreneurs, academics, and artists are all migrating out of the country and seeking better opportunities in Europe or the US. The lack of a diversified economy is a crippling vulnerability for Russia, and the global fall in oil prices has only made economic woes even worse for the nation. This has directly translated into a sharp decline in military capabilities, as budgets shrink and planned replacements for aging equipment fail to materialize. Slowly but surely, the gap in technological capabilities between Russia and the US is growing. The United States has its own financial woes, seeing the worst inflation it's seen in 40 years. With interest rate hikes coming in 2022, the American economy is sure to feel the pinch as investors tighten their purse strings. However, the American economy remains strong and well-diversified, leaving it far less vulnerable to economic disruption than Russia, whether that disruption comes from social change, technology, or war. But what do the numbers say about a possible war between the two heavyweights? Population matters in a prolonged war. Without population, there are no reinforcements, and an economy is far more vulnerable to mass conscription and casualties. The United States has a population of 334,998,000 versus Russia's 142,321,000, giving the U.S. over a 2-to-1 advantage in population. However, that's only part of the story, because Russia's aging population only makes its disadvantages even worse in comparison to the U.S. The U.S. has approximately 147,399,000 conscripts potentially available to fight a brutal multi-year conflict, while Russia only has 69,737,000. Of those potential conscripts, though, approximately 122,274,000 are fit for combat duty in the U.S., while in Russia only 46,681,000 potential recruits are fit for combat. Every year, 4.4 million American youth reach military age, but Russia's population crisis sees only 1.3 million youth reach military age. Both nations are experiencing a decline in birth rates, with the U.S. birth rate at 1.70 and Russia's at 1.50. This is below the 2.1 birth rate required to sustain a population, but the United States continues a positive population growth thanks to healthy amounts of immigration. Russia, on the other hand, is experiencing a population decline. In simple terms, if the two powers engage in a mass casualty conflict that spans multiple years, Russia will be bled dry long before the U.S. is. A modern war, however, will likely be too fast and brutal for population trends to determine a winner, even if it doesn't turn nuclear. That's why what might matter most is the number of personnel both countries can muster within months of hostilities starting. The United States enters a potential conflict with a military of 1.39 million strong, while Russia maintains an active duty force of 850,000. The difference is staggering, with the U.S. military almost twice as big as the Russian military, giving the U.S. an immediate numerical advantage. Another advantage the U.S. enjoys is a professional all-volunteer fighting force, while Russia has had to cancel plans to transition to an all-volunteer force due to economic woes and shrinking budgets. However, Russia has come a long way from when its military was staffed primarily by conscripts, and today only about 30% of the Russian military is conscripted, or about 225,000. The disadvantage is still significant, though. A professional all-volunteer military is more likely to retain highly trained individuals who over time transition into senior leadership positions. This fills the upper echelons of an all-volunteer force with seasoned veterans who make all the difference in combat operations. A conscripted military, however, struggles greatly to retain individuals over the long term, leading to veterancy issues and a lack of well-tested command corps. There's no direct way to measure the advantage of an all-volunteer military versus a partially conscripted one, but throughout history, volunteer soldiers routinely outperform conscripted soldiers, which is what made mercenaries so attractive to world powers throughout most of human history. The United States thus enjoys another advantage over Russia, though that advantage has shrunk due to Russia's growing professional military. A critical component of any army, though, is the strength of its reserve force, especially in modern high-intensity warfare that can see regular forces quickly rendered combat ineffective. The United States maintains a significant reservist force of 442,000 personnel versus Russia's 250,000. In terms of reservists, the U.S. enjoys both an advantage in numbers and training. American reservists receive regular training and even partake in combat deployments, making their competency comparable to many nations' regular forces. This is not an accident, but rather by design. The United States keenly understands that in a modern high-intensity conflict, it will face significant initial losses and is prepared to mitigate this loss in capabilities via a strong reserve force. By comparison, Russian reservist training has been historically spotty at best. Efforts to retain veteran soldiers with reservist contracts hopes to counteract a critical lack of training, but at the moment the Russian reserves simply pale in comparison to American reserves and capabilities. A lack of training also extends to the Russian regular forces as well. Though great leaps have been made to increase the readiness of combat troops, large exercises, however, are not cheap and can produce a great deal of wear and tear on equipment, something that is a critical concern for a Russian army fielding aging equipment and with a limited budget. Thus, while the Russian forces have undergone an increase in military drills in the last decade, they still fail to match the training tempo of their American counterparts. The Russian Air Forces have also seen a dramatic reduction in training, with most pilots flying only between 100 and 120 hours per year. The United States was matching this rate until 2019, when it pushed for an increase to an average of 200 hours per year. Aging military aircraft in both militaries is directly leading to skyrocketing maintenance expenses, and flight hours are threatened with further reduction for both militaries. Big buys of F-35 and 4.5 generation F-15 and F-18s by the US, though, seeks to replace its aging fleet, which has an average age of 28 years. Russia, on the other hand, is procuring jets at a much slower rate. The US spends $770 billion on its military, while Russia spends $154 billion. While adjusted for purchasing power parity, though, the Russian defense budget is closer to $170 billion, given that Russia buys much of its equipment from its native defense contractors. The US still retains a massive advantage, but not as large as one might think, given that salaries and benefits are much more expensive for the US than for Russia. Still, in sheer value, the United States purse is exponentially deeper than the Russian war purse, leading to a much greater proliferation of hardware. In the air, the United States fields a fleet of 13,247 aircraft, over 3 times as large as Russia's air fleet of 4,173. America's fighter fleet is over twice as large as Russia's, with 1,957 fighter aircraft versus Russia's 772. Both US and Russia have nearly the same number of attack aircraft, with 783 versus 739, though this is only because the United States prefers multi-role aircraft over dedicated attack platforms. A significant technological advantage in munitions allows even non-attack aircraft in the US fleet to effectively carry out air-to-sea or air-to-ground strike missions, while Russia struggles with a lack of smart weapons and support platforms for said weapons. This disparity in numbers and capabilities means that the United States Air Force and Navy aren't just better positioned to secure air supremacy, but to exploit it with devastating fire support missions against Russian ground targets. Though American air supremacy will still have to contend with one of the world's best air defense forces. Knowing that it can't match America in the skies, Russia has historically put a lot of weight behind ground-based air defenses, creating some of the most advanced air defense systems in the world. It's assumed then that Russian ground forces will operate under the cover of their ground-based air defense assets, seriously threatening the survival of American attack platforms. However, due to a need to operate under this umbrella of safety, Russian ground forces would be unable to rapidly maneuver, potentially leaving the decisive advantage of momentum in the US hands. In a defensive mode, however, Russian ground forces would be incredibly difficult for the US to break if it was denied its air power by robust air defenses. Mobility is incredibly important in modern warfare, and here the US shines with the largest air and sea mobility fleet in the world. The US operates 982 transport aircraft versus Russia's 445, giving it a decisive advantage in quickly maneuvering troops and equipment in theater. The US's focus on a large mobility fleet, though, is a matter of necessity. Just like the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans both make the United States invulnerable to invasion by any power on Earth, it is just as a big barrier for American troops needing to get to the front. As Russia lacks any capability whatsoever to threaten the US with land invasion, a conflict between the two would be indubitably playing out in Eastern Europe, necessitating the rapid movement of troops and supplies from America to Europe. Once in theater, though, the American air mobility fleet will make it an agile force capable of quickly exploiting opportunities, which can just as quickly replenish losses. One area of air power where the US absolutely dominates Russia or any other world power, though, is in the number of special mission aircraft. These highly specialized platforms are critical for the success of a modern combined arms military and run the gamut from airborne early warning to maritime patrol aircraft to electronic warfare platforms. These aircraft can be everything from eyes in the sky to specialized platforms that listen in on or jam enemy communications and are critical for modern high-tech warfare. Here, the United States fields a whopping 774 special mission platforms versus Russia's 132, putting the logistical, intelligence, and technological advantage firmly on the US side. Attack helicopters are absolutely critical for supporting any ground offensive, and the US operates 366 more of these platforms than Russia, with 910 versus 544. Russia operates 3 main attack helicopters, the Kamov Ka-50 Black Shark, the Mi-24 Hind, and the Mil Mi-28. The US operates the AH-64 Apache and the AH-6M Little Bird. With a focus on special operations, the AH-6M Little Bird provides an extremely agile air support asset for soldiers in dense urban areas, while the US Army's Apache is designed to destroy enemy armor and provide direct fire support for American infantry. The Russian attack helicopter fleet represents the shifting of priorities and ideologies between its years as the Soviet Union and its modern life as the Russian Federation. The Hind is a heavy fire support platform with the capacity to ferry up to 8 fully equipped troops into combat, while the Ka-50 and the Mi-28 represent a more traditional attack helicopter design. Tanks make up the backbone of any modern army, and here both nations shine. The United States has a tank force of 6,612 platforms versus Russia's 12,420. It appears that Russia enjoys a 2-to-1 advantage over the US in the tank arena, but the truth is that Russia inflates the size of its armored forces by counting units kept in storage as part of its active force. In reality, Russia operates closer to 3,000 tanks, with 9,000 mothballed and in reserve. Not only would these tanks require weeks for them and their crews to be prepared for combat, but most are Cold War relics with extremely questionable survivability on a modern battlefield. As Stalin once put it though, quantity is a quality all its own. Though Stalin never lived to see the blistering speed and overwhelming firepower of modern anti-tank platforms. The bulk of Russian tank forces is the T-72, which has received modernity upgrades alongside its M1 Abrams American counterpart. However, pound for pound, the Abrams continues to outclass the T-72. While most comparisons of the Abrams' capabilities rely on the shocking display of overwhelming superiority against Iraq's T-72s, this is a grossly unfair comparison. For starters, export models of Russian T-72s are not nearly as capable as those fielded by the Russian army. Secondly, Russian tank crews are overwhelmingly better trained than their Iraqi counterparts in Desert Storm. The Abrams, however, is still the better tank in 2022. With armor, sight, and electronics upgrades integrated into the active tank force on a consistent basis. Russia, on the other hand, has struggled to keep its own tank forces fully modernized. The one advantage that the T-72 enjoys over the Abrams is its ability to fire anti-tank missiles from its barrel, though doing so requires the T-72 to stand still while guiding its missile to target, during which an Abrams could simply scoot out of the way or kill the T-72. Both Russia and the US place a strong emphasis on mechanized infantry, with the US fielding 45,193 armored vehicles versus Russia's 30,122. While this leaves the US better able to replenish losses, Russia still fields enough armored vehicles to provide ample mobility and protection to its infantry. In a battle of attrition, though, the numbers favor the US. There is one area, however, where Russia dominates not just the United States, but the entire world, and that's artillery. It's said Russia can field enough artillery that if it all fired at once, you'd feel the explosions on the other side of the world. And the numbers are truly astonishing. Russia absolutely dwarfs the US in numbers of self-propelled artillery, with 6,574 platforms versus America's 1,498. The story remains the same for traditional artillery, with 7,571 howitzers versus the US's 1,339. Russia also enjoys a 3-to-1 advantage in rocket artillery, with 3,391 units versus the US's 1,366. The difference is a product of both geography and priorities. Russia has traditionally had to be concerned with fighting a massive land battle in either Europe against NATO or Asia against China. The nation has also had to contend with the reality that in battle against its greatest competitor, the United States, it could not count on air platforms to provide fire support for frontline troops. Facing off against a technologically superior foe, Russia placed an emphasis on sheer firepower. Superior American Abrams tanks don't matter much if they can't advance due to withering barrages of Russian artillery. The US, however, has by necessity shifted most of its fire support capabilities to more mobile airborne platforms. As it faces no threat of invasion or major conflict on its own continent, mobility is more important for the United States military. With a greater focus on technology, mobility, and smart munitions, airborne fire support simply makes more sense to the US military than masses of artillery that need to be transported thousands of miles to any conflict zone. American air-based fire support is far superior even to Russia's masses of artillery on delivering effective fire on target, but only if Russian air defenses can be neutralized. Otherwise, American soldiers might find themselves completely overwhelmed by the world's largest artillery corps. At sea, Russia operates a larger fleet than the United States, with 605 ships versus America's 484. However, the capabilities of America's Navy far surpass those of the Russian Navy, which has historically been the least important of its military branches. Funding priorities reflect this, and today the Russian Navy is in a state of serious decline, operating largely Cold War-era equipment that rarely sees upgrades. The United States currently operates 11 aircraft carriers, with its carrier air forces by themselves larger than most nations' entire air fleets. Russia, by comparison, operates only one, and operates is a term we're using rather loosely here, as the Admiral Kuznetsov is infamous for breakdowns. A remnant of the Cold War, the Kuznetsov is in a perpetual state of disrepair and would be incapable of posing even a moderate threat to U.S. forces before it was destroyed. However, America's mighty carrier fleet is its own vulnerability, with Russia having developed hypersonic anti-ship missiles that present a lethal risk to American naval power. Currently, the United States has no defense against these weapons, except to attack and degrade Russian kill chain assets such as radar tracking installations, communication nodes, and satellites. The United States also operates 9 smaller carriers to support amphibious assault operations, while Russia completely lacks this capability. Amphibious operations would likely not play a big role in a US-Russian conflict, but with the ability to fly the F-35, these mini carriers would only complicate matters for the Russian Air Force and Navy. Russia does outnumber the US in numbers of submarines, with the US operating 68 versus Russia's 70. However, modernity is an issue with Russia's submarine fleet, and it's unknown how many subs Russia can actually put to sea in case of a war, given the state of poor logistics in the Russian Navy. By comparison, the United States submarine fleet is being steadily upgraded with the acquisition of the Virginia-class attack submarine and are on the whole more capable than Russian boats. The United States outnumbers Russia in numbers of destroyers, with 92 guided missile destroyers versus Russia's 15. While outnumbered and outgunned by major combatants, Russia has a far greater fleet of smaller vessels, which could pose a serious threat if massed together or used to harness U.S. supply lines. Russia has also mounted its Caliber cruise missiles on civilian vessels, meaning that any Russian ship could be a potential deadly threat to an unwary American vessel. On the whole, the American military is larger and more capable than the Russian military in 2022. However, Russia has achieved a breakthrough in hypersonic weapons that the US has yet to match, and has even begun to press those weapons into service. This gives Russia a decisive advantage at the opening of any major hostilities, though its weak economy means that the nation can't fully capitalize on this advantage by fielding hypersonic missiles in significant numbers. This is a trend that tracks all across the board, and has repeated itself with the Su-57 fifth-generation fighter and the T-14 Armata tank. Both of these weapon platforms present deadly threats to their U.S. counterparts, but due to a lack of funding, Russia has been forced to postpone any significant purchases for years, if ever. Today, Russia faces a modernity crisis as its legacy forces are being rapidly outclassed technologically by potential rivals. The United States has its own technological problems, however, and over-reliance on technology might become a critical vulnerability for the U.S. military should its satellite or command and control networks be compromised. An addiction to technology by the United States has also led to a legacy of weapons acquisitions in the post-2000s that is, frankly, catastrophic. Funneling billions upon billions into moonshot after moonshot, the United States has failed to bring few of its new weapon systems in the last 20 years to full maturity. The F-35's capabilities are still so in question that both the U.S. Navy and Air Force purchased significant amounts of F-15s and F-18s to compensate for the potential crisis. The Zumwalt destroyer and littoral combat ships were both complete boondoggles that cost billions and left the U.S. Navy high and dry. The failure of the Future Force Warrior program left the U.S. Army with few working technologies and a massive waste of taxpayer money. A focus on technological moonshots has eroded the United States' technological advantage significantly, and today the American military is in desperate need of new weapons platforms that can not just match, but outcompete those being developed or already in service with the armies of China and Russia. In mid-June 2020, World War III started trending on Twitter again. This time it was because a border dispute in the Himalayas between Chinese and Indian forces turned deadly, killing upward of 20 people. This is the first time since 1975 that the two countries have had a fatal conflict, and the most serious skirmish since 1967. Naturally, as the two nations are populous, militarily powerful, and have nuclear capabilities, the world is biting its nails to see what happens next. But assuming the whole thing doesn't end in diplomacy or a world-consuming mushroom cloud, which country has what it takes to bring home a final victory? Using a mix of historical precedents of the prior conflicts between the two countries and our knowledge of their current military capabilities, we intend to find out exactly whether China or India would win if the two nations went to war today. After all, we're not just talking about dusty hypotheticals here. Relations between India and China have been extremely strained since the Sino-Indian War of 1962, which occurred over the same stretch of the Himalayan border that's causing conflicts today. India had granted the Dalai Lama asylum within their borders after the fallout of the 1959 Tibetan uprising, already putting them in China's bad books. And with China's military encroaching on the line of actual control, the demarcation line that separates Indian and Chinese territory in the Himalayas, a military skirmish was practically inevitable. The resulting conflict was short-lived, lasting only 1 month and 1 day between October and November of 1962. The People's Liberation Army of China had a vast numerical superiority over India's military forces, and India suffered significantly greater losses, with nearly double China's deaths, many wounded and over 3,000 captured. This loss is partly chalked up to the fact that it's believed, according to some leaked CIA documents, that India underestimated both China's military capabilities and their willingness to escalate the conflict. While India requested military assistance from the US in the form of 12 squadrons of fighter jets, their pleas were rejected, and India instead turned to Moscow for assistance. Ultimately, none of it did all that much good, as China claimed the eastern theater up to the line of actual control before declaring a unilateral ceasefire. India was left to lick its wounds, and tensions between the two countries have been high ever since, with conflicts still breaking out well into the 70s. Both nations have ramped up militarization around the line of actual control as a show of strength, and this has left both with very little room to maneuver. In a sense, the Himalayan border is a military powder keg, and lately we've been seeing the sparks. While a past record of military supremacy definitely works in China's favor, the Sino-Indian War was also 58 years ago, and failure is an excellent teacher. India has been engaged in frequent conflicts since the Sino-Indian War, giving their combatants invaluable battlefield experience. India is widely believed to have won every conflict they engaged in post-Sino-Indian War, with the exception of the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965, which ended in a ceasefire. China comparatively fought its last considerable conflict against Vietnamese forces in 1979. Once again, experience won out here, as the Vietnamese, who'd recently honed their skills in battle against the forces of the United States, are largely considered to have handed China's asses to them. This is why the value of actual experience in war can never be overstated. But let's take a step back and look at what these two militaries have to offer in terms of manpower, technology, training, and resources. First, soldiers, the bread and butter of any military. Much like the Sino-Indian War, China has numerical superiority, though in India's defense, seeing as China is ranked as having the highest number of active military personnel in the world at 2,035,000, China's military has numerical superiority over literally everyone. With over 500,000 reserve personnel who could be easily called into action in a wartime scenario, China is a force to be reckoned with. India, however, isn't all that far behind, with 1,237,117 active personnel and an impressive 960,000 reserve personnel, putting the difference between their totals in the mere hundred thousands. But here's the big twist. The numbers here only pertain to the Indian Army, which is the ground force branch of the Indian Armed Forces, whose total number of active personnel are 1,444,500, second only to the PLA's total active personnel. However, the overall numbers of reserve personnel for the Indian Armed Forces now dwarfs China's at an astonishing 2.1 million. The Indian Navy boasts 67,252 active personnel and 55,000 reserves. The Indian Air Force has 139,576 active personnel and 140,000 reserves. In contrast to India's three-pronged system, the PLA consists of 5 branches: the Ground Force, Navy, Air Force, Rocket Force, and the Strategic Assault Force. The Ground Force is the Chinese infantry and land-based operations, with 975,000 active personnel. The PLA Navy has 240,000 active personnel. The Air Force even higher at 398,000 active personnel. The People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, also known by the pretty funny acronym PLARF, is the branch of the military in charge of the land-based ballistic and nuclear armaments. They have only 100,000 active personnel. And finally, the Strategic Assault Force. This is the newest branch of the PLA, established officially in 2015, dealing with extremely modern forms of warfare like space and cyber operations. This division is so new that we don't even have an exact number of active personnel, but due to the specialization of the job and the fact that the group is only 5 years old, it's safe to assume that it's likely the smallest branch of the PLA. However, we also have a far wider trend to consider here. The fact that China and India are two of the most populous nations on Earth, with populations of 1.393 billion and 1.353 billion respectively, as of 2018. In a situation of all-out war over their shared border, if both nations introduced conscription, the numerical differences between their armies would ultimately be nebulous. So, if neither army would have an extreme numerical edge in the case of another conflict, let's zoom in and take a look at the average military service member in each infantry, specifically their training, equipment, and weaponry. Thankfully for India, they've grown to invest in more intensive military training over the years, including joint operations training with the British, US, Japanese, French, and Australian militaries as their involvement in the UN deepened. The Indian military has also consistently invested in modernized primary assault rifle systems for their troops, currently working with a mix of American Sig Sauer 716 assault rifles and an Indo-Russian AK-47-203, a modernization of the famously reliable and hardy AK-47. As of 2018, Indian infantry troops are fitted with SMPP ballistic armor, even capable of withstanding blasts from the steel core rounds fired out of an AK-47. All these factors add up to one formidable individual soldier. China's infantry troops don't have quite the same thing going for them. Modern Chinese military training has been criticized for years for its lack of useful applications in real-life combat scenarios, meaning the average military skills of a Chinese infantryman may leave something to be desired compared to their Indian counterparts. They're formidable in the rifle department with the QBZ-95-1, a reliable bullpup rifle which performs best at long range. However, despite China being one of the world's most prolific exporters of body armor, it hasn't historically fitted its troops with that same standard of protection. The PLA is notorious for its light loadout, often leaving soldiers ill-prepared for taking fire, and giving the Indian infantry troops a huge comparative advantage. However, this may change in the not-too-distant future. According to a report from Global Times, China is investing heavily in updating and modernizing its training system, as well as planning on procuring 1.4 million units of high-quality body armor for the PLA. While this isn't currently a certainty, if these plans do go through, any advantages that the Indian Army may have had on an individual soldier level would essentially evaporate, leaving them dead even once again. But these days, war is far more complex than a large group of armed men running at each other and fighting down to the last one standing. In modern warfare, technology can give militaries the crucial edge they need to secure a victory over the enemy. Since 2008, China and India have ranked second and third respectively in global military spending, but the gap between them is still pretty immense. Last year, China spent an astonishing $261 billion on military development, compared to India's far smaller $71.1 billion. This disparity becomes a little more natural when you realize that China's economy is 5 times the size of India's. Let's take a look at how these numbers actually translate into vehicles for their armies, navies, and air forces. While China is generally packing more hardware than India, one exception is in the world of tanks, where India's over 4,200 stands over 1,000 units greater than China's 3,200 plus tanks. However, this doesn't paint the whole picture of China's ground capabilities. If we're looking at the number of armored ground vehicles overall, China's 33,000 dwarfs India's 8,600, giving them considerable ground superiority, bolstered by the fact that they have 10 times more rocket projectors than their Indian counterparts. China also holds dominance over the skies with 3,210 aircraft compared to India's 2,123. It also has approximately double the fighter and interceptor jets and 507 workable airports compared to India's 346. Once again, sadly for India, this trend continues into the country's navies. In terms of total naval assets, China outnumbers India by 777 to 285. More specifically, it has 74 submarines to India's 16, 36 destroyers to India's 11, and if wars were decided on equipment alone, it's unquestionable that China would take the win here. Of course, while nobody on Earth wants the conflict to escalate to this point for the sake of all human life, we'd be remiss to not return to the fact that China and India are both nuclear nations. If the war ever did become an exchange of nuclear force, who would come out on top? Well, for a number of reasons, China has a clear edge here. Not only did they develop their nuclear capabilities just over a decade earlier than India in 1964, New Delhi wouldn't have its first nuke until 1975, but their nuclear arsenal is also double the size of India's with a far quicker growth rate. China has a stockpile of 320 nuclear warheads, having grown by 40 in the past year. Compare this to India with only 150 nuclear warheads, which grew by a mere 10 in the past year. both nations can deploy these warheads via the nuclear triad of missiles, submarines, and bombers, and thankfully for the human race, both have a no first strike policy. This means the warheads can only be used in retaliation to another nuclear attack, making it less likely that either country would want to strike first. Of course, if either did, all of us would ultimately lose from the resulting radioactive firefight. But on sheer numbers, China takes the clear win with regard to nuclear capabilities. One final factor worth considering is one that's rarely mentioned in a lot of abstract military planning: allies. While it's easy to think of war purely in terms of enemies, your diplomatic and military friends can also be a make or break factor in determining the outcome of a conflict. While China could largely be working a solo war against India with the exception of perhaps Pakistan, a country with fraught relationships with India to say the least, India itself has been building diplomatic relationships with a number of extremely valuable allies. These include the United States, a country with the highest military spending in the world, who under President Trump have gone cold on relations with China while referring to India as a major defense partner. India has also developed strong diplomatic ties to Japan, France, and Australia through performing a number of joint military drills with all of them. Having these various world powers behind them gives India a serious combat edge over China, providing these allies come to India's side in their time of need. While the US could be India's greatest ally in this speculative war, foreign policy under President Trump has been known to be capricious and unreliable to other allies, such as the Kurdish forces in Syria in 2019. So there's really no way of telling for sure. So back to our big question: who would win in a modern conflict between India and China? Turns out it's a lot more complex than you may have thought. While a layman might assume that China's apparent numerical and monetary advantages hand it an easy win, these advantages can be neutralized by India's stronger troops, who are better equipped, better trained, and more experienced, and its greater network of powerful allies. Then there's the strategic picture. As while the Indian Navy is smaller than the Chinese Navy, India itself is situated on the jugular of Chinese trade, so to speak. Chinese trade ships must pass through the Indian Ocean to reach their destinations, and while China may have a larger fleet, it's not very well equipped to conduct operations far from its own shores. With only 2 aircraft carriers with a capacity of about 24 aircraft between them, and one not even being operational yet, any Chinese incursion into the Indian Ocean to protect its trade fleets would be disastrous, as the Chinese task force would be brutally pounded by Indian air and naval power. With China receiving the bulk of its oil from maritime trade routes, a protracted war between the two nations would inevitably cripple the Chinese military and industry both. India would simply have to fight defensively, as the terrain separating India and China is extremely difficult and well suited to defensive warfare. While the Chinese could crush any Indian incursion into China itself, and there'd be few strategic targets to take close to the Indian border anyway, a war between the two nations would inevitably see India the winner, as it slowly strangles Chinese trade to death. It's a rumble in the jungle, a showdown on the 38th parallel. The Hermit Kingdom of North Korea versus the United States of America. Kim Jong-un versus, well, we're not really sure who because this script was written before the presidential election. It's the American bald eagle versus the North Korean, trash pigeon? That doesn't really seem like North Korea has an official national animal. It's a showdown the world's been expecting for decades. But how do these two antagonist powers stack up? Who really has the advantage in a showdown on the Korean peninsula? For this scenario, let's compare the two countries alone, and without the help of allies, to see how they really measure up against each other. Overall, the United States is ranked as the world's #1 military power, and currently the only global superpower. It's a common mistake to call Russia or China superpowers, but the definition of a superpower is a state that can exert economic, cultural, and military influence worldwide. Currently, the US is the only nation with the military fleets and cultural and economic clout to do so. North Korea is no slouch, though, in the military department, and despite being a financially destitute hermit kingdom, it's managed to field a military that places it at the number 25 spot in global rankings. This is because most of the official budget of the North Korean government goes to its military, and the military also receives hundreds of millions in covert financing, typically the result of state-sponsored criminal enterprises. In terms of manpower, the United States fields an active duty force of 1.4 million personnel versus North Korea's 1.28 million. The US also fields a greater force of reservists, with 860,000 personnel versus North Korea's reserve force of 600,000. The US barely has the numbers advantage here, but in a grueling multi-year conflict, the US has the population advantage, with 4.2 million reaching service age every year versus North Korea's measly 415,000. If North Korea wants to win, clearly it has to secure victory as quickly as possible. Wars cost money though, and it turns out it's an extremely expensive affair. The latest US defense budget is about $750 billion versus North Korea's $1.6 billion. This, of course, is only the official government figure, and North Korea's real defense budget is easily hundreds of millions greater thanks to all that black market activity. Remember kids, doing drugs may seem tubular, but you're just gonna help North Korea go nuclear. But let's check out all the toys that those big budgets buy. In the air, the US fields 13,264 aircraft versus North Korea's 949. Not only is this a massive numbers disparity, but a huge disparity in capabilities as well. The US currently relies on the F-15 Eagle and the F-18 Super Hornet as its primary air defense and air attack platforms. These two aircraft are fourth-generation models, but have received serious upgrades to their capabilities which boost them into a fourth-and-a-half-generation capability. Complementing U.S. fighter forces are 187 F-22s, the world's only fully operational fifth-generation fighter, and officially the world's deadliest fighter aircraft. As more and more F-35s come online, however, and achieve initial operational capability status, the entire U.S. fighter fleet is poised to become fully fifth-generation, a significant battlefield advantage against any foe. North Korean air forces are decades behind the U.S. in capability. Its most numerous fighter aircraft, the Chengdu J-7, was developed in the 1960s and exported by China. Its most capable aircraft, the MiG-29, was deployed in the 70s as a counter to the American F-15. However, North Korea's MiG-29s number at only 35, and it's believed that they lack anything resembling modern avionics. To make matters worse, North Korea's entire inventory of air-to-air missiles herald back to the Cold War, and the nation possesses less than 500 of them. An air battle between the US and North Korea would be hopeless for the Hermit Kingdom, which is why its pilots are trained in kamikaze tactics. If war were to break out, North Korea's Air Force would launch one-way attacks across the DMZ, knowing its Air Force could never survive an air war. In the mountainous terrain of North Korea, perhaps no aircraft is more important, however, than the attack helicopter. Capable of taking out armored forces and providing recon and fire support in places regular aircraft would find it difficult to operate, attack helicopters would be of paramount importance in a showdown between the two countries. The U.S. fields an inventory of 967 Apache helicopters, one of the deadliest attack helos ever built. Not only is each Apache equipped with state-of-the-art electronics and sensors, but these agile birds are extremely tough to boot. When an entire flight of Apaches was ambushed in a protracted battle against insurgents on the ground in Afghanistan, the U.S. famously only lost a single bird while decimating ground forces below them. North Korea's 20 attack helos are Soviet-built MiG-24 Hinds, an extremely capable attack helicopter that, despite being dated, still packs an impressive punch. Good thing for the U.S. ground forces that North Korea only operates a small amount of these powerful Russian birds of prey. On the ground, North Korea is almost neck and neck with the U.S. in terms of armored forces, with 6,045 combat tanks versus the U.S.'s 6,289. The two tank armies are almost evenly matched in terms of numbers. In terms of quality, though, well, North Korea once more suffers greatly. North Korea's most formidable tank is a native upgrade to the Soviet T-62, known as Chonmaho, with the T-62 being North Korea's most numerous, nearly modern design. Large numbers of them were upgraded with new armor, fire, and sighting systems, and other sensors. In effect, these might be upgraded designs, but the core model is still the 1960s-era T-62. It's known that North Korea operates at least 1,000 of these tanks, but may have upwards of 1,200. North Korea's second most prolific tank is the T-54 and T-55, of which it operates 2,000. These dated, underpowered tanks were terrifying when first fielded by the Soviet Union in the 50s. But as Iraq found out in the First Gulf War, present absolutely zero threat to the U.S. modern Abrams. On the ground, North Korea's tank forces simply could not hope to do more than delay an American armored advance. One area where North Korea rises above the U.S., though, is in the size of its rocket artillery forces, fielding 2,110 versus the U.S.'s 1,366. Rocket artillery may not have the endurance of fire of traditional artillery, but provides one extremely crucial advantage over regular artillery. By firing all of its munitions in extremely rapid succession, rocket artillery puts all of its steel on target within seconds, giving troops and vehicles little time to seek cover. While the US fields more modern versions of rocket projectors, the technology is so simple that even North Korea's Soviet-era technology poses a significant and deadly threat to US forces. On the seas, the US fields a fleet of 490 ships versus North Korea's 984. North Korea may seem to have an advantage in numbers, but that's because the vast majority of its ships are small torpedo boats that can't operate far from shore. The second largest element of North Korea's navy is its underwater forces, with one of the world's largest submarine forces numbering anywhere between 60 and 80. 40 of these subs are the medium-sized diesel-electric Sango class, built in the late 90s. While not particularly advanced versus the US Navy's Los Angeles and Virginia-class nuclear submarines, diesel-electric submarines used in a defensive posture close to the shore can be an incredibly effective force, even if technologically outclassed. By loitering near the shore and running silently on battery power, North Korea could simply choose to have these subs lie in wait for oncoming US ships and launch deadly ambushes. The nation's willingness to operate these craft in a kamikaze style similar to its air force only adds to the deadliness of North Korea's submarine force. By comparison, the US operates 66 submarines, most of which are Los Angeles-class attack submarines. These are in the process of being phased out by the new Virginia class, which incorporates many of the Seawolf-class technologies at a lower cost and thus with less effectiveness than the deadly Seawolf, which is sadly far too expensive to field in large numbers. 3 of the legendary Seawolf-class submarines remain in service with the Navy, with no near-term plans to retire them, though the Navy is planning on acquiring a new modern variant of the Seawolf to use on extremely important or sensitive missions. With 20 aircraft carriers, which includes smaller carriers meant to support amphibious operations, the US is guaranteed to have air power anywhere in the world it needs it. By comparison, North Korea has 0 aircraft carriers and could not hope to ever operate one in its current economic climate, let alone ensure it survives first contact against US forces. Despite all these naval advantages to the US, though, North Korea once more has the advantage in one area: mine warfare. With 23 vessels especially equipped to mine sea lanes versus the US's 11, North Korea is poised to make an amphibious attack against it by the superior US fleet a costly affair in terms of manpower and equipment. Clearing sea mines is an extremely time-consuming and dangerous affair, and with so many mine-laying ships, North Korea could make entire beaches and ports completely inaccessible to US forces. The military advantage is clearly in favor of the US, but a showdown between the two countries is far more nuanced than merely comparing numbers. The US must maintain global commitments even during a war, meaning that it wouldn't be able to commit more than 30 to 40% of its total force to a conflict with North Korea. That brings the number parity way down on the US side, though the US's far superior equipment and training, or force multipliers, practically ensure a US victory. However, it would be an extremely costly victory for the US and its allies, as North Korea is well prepared to make a push north from South Korea an exceedingly bloody affair. With its mine-laying capabilities, the North Korean Navy could make the ocean around the Korean peninsula inaccessible for weeks, disrupting not just military operations, but civilian traffic as well, and shutting down one of the busiest trade arteries in the world. Then there's North Korea's nuclear program, the full extent of which is still not known. What is clear is that North Korea has the materials and technology for several bombs. Some estimates place the current North Korean stockpile at 30 to 40 weapons. Even though most of these weapons couldn't reach the US mainland, they would make any conflict on the peninsula an extremely dangerous affair, with a losing Kim Jong-un likely to decide to use nuclear weapons against US forces and South Korea, rather than be deposed as so many dictators before him. It's a showdown that's been brewing for years, and 2022 is increasingly looking like the year that the war everyone has feared will finally happen: the United States versus Iran. How do the two sides stack up to each other, and how would a war between the two play out? Iran is ranked in 14th place amongst the world's top militaries. Not bad for a nation that's been under severe sanctions for years. But today it's facing off against the world's #1 ranked military and only global superpower, the United States of America. A conflict between Iran and the US is unlikely to become severe enough to cause a need for the US to fully mobilize its population, though Iran might certainly need to. However, more population means a bigger economy and more capabilities, and here the United States takes the cake, with a population of 335 million versus Iran's 186 million. That's a difference of 249 million more Americans than Iranians. Of that population, though, the US could call on 147 million for potential military service, though only 122 million of them are physically or mentally fit enough to actually serve. Iran, on the other hand, has a manpower pool of 48 million, with only 40 million actually fit for service. If a war between Iran and the US were to turn into a multi-year stalemate, it would be important to quickly replenish losses. And here too, the United States holds the advantage, with 4.3 million teenagers reaching military age annually, versus Iran's 1.3 million. Currently, though, on active duty, the United States has the world's third largest military, with a 1.39 million strong military versus Iran's 575,000. Reserves are important for replenishing casualties and rotating out exhausted troops to give them a chance to recoup and recover, and both countries are pretty evenly matched there, with the US having a reservist force of 442,000 versus Iran's 350,000. Iran enjoys such large amounts of reservists thanks to the fact that its military service is compulsory for all males upon reaching adulthood. This means that the Iranian active duty military is largely made up of conscripts, with few professional volunteer soldiers. These conscripts are typically drafted at age 19 and made to serve 2 years, though few receive much useful military training during that time. Most Iranian soldiers rarely ever fire their weapons and have to work with equipment that's mostly from the first half of the Cold War. This is in sharp contrast with the US military, which maintains an aggressive year-round training cycle. Training is frequently punctuated with small-scale exercises and occasionally with larger multi-unit exercises. The US Navy's RIMPAC exercise, for example, is a massive event that takes place every 2 years and involves the military forces of over 24 partner nations across the Pacific Rim. Not only do conscripts traditionally perform very poorly against professional all-volunteer forces, but Iran's conscripts undergo very little useful training and would be completely overwhelmed against America's professionally trained warfighters. A military is only as good as the equipment it can afford, and war is a costly affair. Iran has an annual budget of $5 billion for its military, though the nation spends significant amounts of money under the table carrying out various military-related activities in its sphere of influence. By comparison, the United States has a defense budget of $770 billion, absolutely dwarfing what Iran spends annually. In the realm of military hardware, Iran fields an air force of 543 planes versus the US's 13,247. Of these, on Iran's side, 197 are fighter aircraft, while the US maintains a fighter fleet of 1,957. If Iran and the US were to come to blows, the US might find itself surprised to be taking on one of its own most capable fighters ever built during the Cold War. That's because Iran is still fielding the F-14 Tomcat, having an estimated 40 of them still in service. This is thanks to a pre-revolution deal with the Iranian government that saw them buy 80 of the planes, though only 79 were delivered. After the revolution, the United States shut down all support for Iran's Tomcat fleet, and it feared having to go up against the formidable fighter so much that it actually destroyed every single Tomcat it retired to prevent Iran from having any opportunity of seizing badly needed parts for maintenance. Without US support for parts replacement, its Tomcat fleet has been steadily shrinking as planes are cannibalized to keep others flying. Today, it's believed between 40 to 43 of them are still mission capable, with 20 fully mission capable and 20 only partially mission capable. The rest of Iran's air fleet is made up of Cold War-era MiG-29s, American F-4 Phantom IIs and F-5 Tiger II, Chinese J-7s, Mirage F-1s, Su-22s, and domestically made at HESA Kosar and HESA Saeke. The latter are only available in very low numbers and are both light attack jets, widely considered to be very inefficient machines. In a ground attack role, Iran is forced to use multi-role planes such as the Su-22 and domestically modified F-5E, known as the HESA Azarash. Both planes are only suited for small-scale strike missions, and with a lack of targeting pods are incapable of precision strikes. Iran's fighter fleet is largely non-modern, though some of their planes have received fourth-generation avionics. However, so many different aircraft models are a nightmare to conduct maintenance on, so it's unlikely many of these planes are actually operationally ready, and even less likely they would remain so during high-tempo combat operations. Such a diverse and mixed air fleet drives up both maintenance costs and time, and can make sourcing replacement parts a nightmare. By comparison, though, the United States fields the world's most modern air fleet, though some of the planes are showing a growing lack of modernity. The F-15 Eagle and F-16 Fighting Falcon are both extremely capable fighter aircraft, capable of both air superiority and ground attack, but are showing their age against increasingly sophisticated modern fighters and air defenses. America's F-22 remains the single deadliest airplane in the sky, with significant capability overmatch against any other fighter aircraft in the world. However, it's also one of the most expensive aircraft in the world, forcing the U.S. Air Force to limit its production run to just under 200. Today, 195 remain in service, and no further Raptors will ever be built. Instead, the U.S. Air Force is already looking ahead to a sixth-generation fighter for air superiority, with a prototype already tested and flown. In the meantime, it relies on its fleet of F-15s and F-35s for the air superiority mission, with 283 fifth-generation F-35s across all arms of the U.S. military. This number grows every year, with a planned purchase of 1,763 F-35s for just the U.S. Air Force alone. Lockheed Martin is set to provide the U.S. military with approximately 135 planes per year until the contract is completed, making U.S. Air Forces deadlier with every passing year. The U.S. Navy and Marines, meanwhile, operate the vaunted F-18 Super Hornet, which replaced the F-14 Tomcat in 1985. One of the most agile jets on the planet, it's light enough to be launched from carriers, but capable of bringing large weapons packages to the fight, making it perfect as a multi-role fighter. To support ground troops, though, the U.S. Air Force relies on the A-10 Thunderbolt II, an impressive ground attack aircraft that has achieved legendary status since its introduction in 1977. Strategic bombing is carried out by a mixed fleet of B-52 Stratofortresses, B-2 Spirits, and B-1B Lancers. The B-52 was put into service first in 1955 and incredibly is set to remain in service until the 2050s, making it the longest service aircraft in history. Thanks to aggressive upgrades, the plane remains one of the deadliest bombers in the sky and proved itself against the Soviet defenses during the Vietnam War thanks to its aggressive suite of electronic warfare countermeasures. The American B-2 fleet was originally designed to slip behind enemy lines and deliver strategic nuclear strikes, and remains the world's only stealth bomber. An upgrade after the fall of the Soviet Union saw it geared for more conventional combat, and now is tasked with slipping through the densest enemy air defenses and eliminating high-value targets. The B-1B Lancer is a much faster strategic bomber that has less endurance than the B-52, but can fly at supersonic speeds to deliver bombs quickly where they're needed the most. America's overwhelming advantage in attack aircraft places Iranian ground forces at serious risk. Unlike powers like China and Russia, U.S. aircraft are largely multi-role capable, and its pilots trained in both air superiority and ground attack missions. This gives the United States a significant advantage over any competitor, and an edge that only makes a war an increasingly bad proposition for Iran. To fend off the mighty U.S. Air Force, Iran relies not on air superiority fighters, but on a robust layer of ground-based air defenses. At the outermost layer are Iran's longest-range air defenses, the Bavar 373, which is a reverse-engineered Russian S-300. It also has a few S-300 batteries courtesy of Russia, who delivered them in 2015 after Iran joined the JCPOA nuclear deal. With a range of 155 miles, these present a significant threat to fourth-generation aircraft, but F-35s equipped with glide bombs or even B-52s using standoff attack munitions could easily overwhelm and destroy these batteries on their radar. At intermediate range, Iran fields an update on a reverse-engineered American SM-1 missile sold to the Iranian Navy prior to the revolution. The 1960s tech has been updated with domestic upgrades, producing the Sayyad-2, which boasts a range of 46 miles, though the longer Sayyad-3 has a range of 75 miles. These missiles can be difficult to destroy on the ground because they can be mounted on very agile truck-mounted launchers, which can rapidly reposition. For short to intermediate range engagements, Iran has the Salimcha missiles, produced from reverse-engineered American Hawk missiles provided to Iran in the 1960s. Iran also has a new triple-rail launcher system called Mersad and has the ability to engage up to 2 targets simultaneously. Various other foreign-source SAM systems have been cloned or reverse-engineered by Iran, and the nation fields a sizable quantity of low-altitude defense systems meant to be used against helicopters. However dense Iranian air defenses are, most of them are static and well known to the U.S. By using a combination of stealth aircraft, standoff attack munitions, and electronic jamming, the U.S. with its overwhelming air fleet could easily dismantle the Iranian air defense system, just like the U.S. did with zero or minimal losses in Iraq, Libya, and Syria. To support its ground forces, Iran has nothing more than a token attack helicopter fleet, which would not survive initial contact against U.S. forces equipped with short-range air defenses and manpads. The U.S., on the other hand, has the world's largest attack helicopter fleet, made up of 910 helicopters, including the Apache and Super Cobra used by the American Marine Corps. These attack helicopters are both heavily armored and can provide flexible close air support, as well as engage in reconnaissance and hunter-killer missions. The Apache in particular is an incredibly robust aircraft, with only a single Apache lost to heavy anti-aircraft fire during an ambush by Iraq's military at Najaf. However, the 32 Apaches were forced to retreat and unable to carry out their deep attack mission behind enemy lines, which is their primary purpose. This has prompted the need by the U.S. Army to replace its aging Apaches with more capable variants who can survive modern combat. In a conflict between between Iran and the US, tanks will largely be the dominant weapon of choice thanks to a largely flat, open terrain of the country. Iran brings 2,831 tanks to fight, while the United States has the world's second-largest fleet at 6,612. Iran's tanks, however, are mostly Cold War relics, though it does field capable T-72s upgraded with modern armor, sensor, and cannons. However, Iran's tanks are largely considered to be inferior to any Western model, let alone the vaunted American Abrams. An effort to build a next-generation domestic tank failed in the late 2010s and was likely just a big publicity ploy to get Russia to lower its asking price for supplying the country with tanks. The Zulfikar series of domestically made tanks suffer from weapons embargoes, leaving Iran incapable of equipping them with truly modern systems. The United States' own Abrams have been continuously upgraded since their introduction to the U.S. Armed Forces. Currently, the Abrams tank fleet is being upgraded to System Enhancement Program version 4, which finally brings a third-generation thermal imager to the Abrams tank, a key weakness plaguing American tanks for years. Trophy anti-missile defense systems have also started to be integrated into American tanks, using radar and explosive charges to defeat enemy anti-tank missiles. To see why this has become so critically important, one only need to look at the performance of Russian armor in Ukraine today, with Ukraine forces killing hundreds of modern Russian tanks with anti-tank missiles. With each upgrade, though, the Abrams tank is becoming heavier and heavier, a serious problem for the tank fleet, as it's now feared the tank might be too heavy to cross some bridges. Greater weight also means more fuel expenditure, lowering its already short combat range between 93 and 124 miles in cross-country conditions. However, American Abrams would prove absolutely lethal to Iran's own tank fleets, and their improved protection against RPGs and IEDs means that they'll even be more survivable in urban environments, where most of the fighting will likely end up taking place. Armored personnel carriers are important for helping support one's infantry and protecting them in a deadly modern battlefield. The United States can boast total mechanized capabilities for its infantry, while Iran struggles to do the same. The U.S. fields a fleet of over 45,000 armored vehicles versus Iran's 7,600. Again, Iran's armored vehicles are early Russian or late Soviet models, and severely lacking in modernity upgrades thanks to budget limitations and sanctions. American Bradleys, meanwhile, are capable of engaging other lightly armored vehicles and even taking out tanks thanks to 2 anti-tank missiles on each vehicle. Both Iran and the U.S. have comparable amounts of artillery, with the U.S. fielding 1,498 self-propelled artillery and 1,339 towed artillery such as howitzers. Iran, meanwhile, has 1,030 self-propelled artillery and 2,108 towed artillery pieces. The similarity in capabilities here is because the United States traditionally relies on much more flexible and accurate air assets for fire support, even though its artillery corps are significantly more capable than Iran's own thanks to the use of smart munitions. New guided projectiles have actually earned American artillery a world record for distance, firing a shell 43 miles and hitting a practice target with pinpoint accuracy. However, even Iran's dumb artillery is a significant threat to both vehicles and personnel, and the large numbers of artillery available to Iran should not be ignored in a potential conflict scenario. Of course, thanks to air dominance, Iranian artillery batteries would be decidedly non-survivable assets in combat. Multiple rocket projectors or rocket artillery can be devastating when used against infantry. By firing significant numbers of rockets in short succession, MLRS rocket systems deny infantry a chance to get to cover the way tube artillery and its far slower rate of fire does. The US employs 1,366 MLRS, while Iran has 2,485, again mostly Russian or Soviet-made. For all the incompetence of Russia's modern military forces, the Ukrainian conflict shows that even basic MLRS systems are devastating when used in large numbers. This too is a threat that shouldn't be discarded, but unlikely to be very survivable against the US's air fleets. Naval operations will be an important part of a war between Iran and the US. At sea, the US fields a navy made up of 484 vessels versus Iran's 142. However, most of Iran's navy is made up of smaller patrol boats. The US, meanwhile, operates 11 supercarriers, each carrying 4 squadrons of attack aircraft and various special mission aircraft such as tankers, electronic warfare platforms, and airborne radar. The US also has a fleet of 9 smaller carriers meant to support amphibious operations, equipped with helicopters and the US Marines variant of the F-35, capable of vertical landing. Under the waves, the U.S. has a fleet of 68 submarines, with the new Virginia-class submarines replacing Cold War-era Los Angeles-class subs. American submarines aren't just deadly to Iran's navy, but can even use cruise missiles to attack land targets deep inside Iranian territory. Long holding the advantage in underwater tech, American subs are notoriously stealthy and difficult to track. Iran, meanwhile, has a fleet of 19 subs, though most of these are midget submarines. These small submarines are primarily meant to attack shipping inside the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman, with Iran's stated goal of being to block traffic of large oil-laden ships in case of war with the US. This would have a devastating effect on global gas prices, and it's the US's top priority to locate and destroy these tiny submarines before they can succeed in their mission. The rest of the Iranian submarine fleet consists of 3 Soviet-era Kilo-class and 1 Iranian Fateh-class submarine, though the latter is not well suited for deep-water operations. Again, largely lacking in modernity, the fact that these are diesel-electric submarines means there could still be a significant threat to unwary U.S. assets. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. Navy allowed its once prolific anti-submarine warfare capabilities to seriously atrophy, leading to a series of embarrassing exercises with friendly nation submarines in the early 2000s. However, since then, any hostilities seem more likely with China, and the U.S. has beefed up its ASW capabilities once more, even adopting fleets of drones to aid in the task of hunting down and tracking enemy subs. Killing a major American ship with an older and less technologically advanced sub is not impossible for Iran, but very difficult and extremely unlikely to happen more than once. Iran's surface fleet has only about 9 major combatants in the form of corvettes and frigates, the rest being fast attack boats and patrol boats. Iran's surface combatants would face 92 American destroyers and 22 corvettes, though likely it would be carrier-based aircraft who would destroy Iran's surface fleet before it can take much action against American ships. However, smaller patrol and torpedo boats could prove more difficult to target, and if employed in swarm tactics, could end up at least causing significant damage to large U.S. ships. The advantage is clearly on the U.S. side in almost every single category, with U.S. forces fielding far more capable equipment and having better trained troops. So, how would a war with Iran play out? A real war would be unlikely to include ground forces, as the U.S. would be very reluctant to get dragged into yet a third ground war in the Middle East. However, if removal of the regime was necessary for some reason, the U.S. would have to commit ground forces in the effort. First, American carrier-based aircraft, supported by the Air Force strike aircraft flying from nearby friendly airfields in Saudi Arabia, would launch a massive air assault against the nation. No doubt, Iran would immediately or even preemptively launch a large ballistic missile attack against these airfields and even U.S. vessels, but thanks to robust air defenses and the assistance of Saudi defenses, few of these missiles would cause significant damage. Iran has proven in multiple missile attacks against Israeli targets that its targeting capabilities are spotty at best, further reducing the threat posed by ballistic missiles. American Wild Weasel aircraft would first engage enemy air defenses, destroying either missile platforms themselves or their supporting radar. More mobile, shorter-range air defenses might threaten some U.S. aircraft, but it's unlikely that Iran would down a significant amount of U.S. planes. Traditionally, the U.S. is extremely good at neutralizing air defense networks, and while some air defenses may be mobile, their radars rarely ever are. Without radar, most air defense assets are practically useless. Iran could rely on actual anti-air artillery left over from the Cold War, but with U.S. planes flying so high, this is unlikely to achieve any results. Next, American planes would pummel missile sites, command and control nodes, logistics hubs, and even troop barracks, bringing devastation across the country from the air. Strikes would also take place against port facilities and major surface warships, while under the waves, U.S. attack submarines in cooperation with ASW aircraft work to pinpoint Iran's submarine fleet and neutralize it. However, even an overwhelming aerial campaign would be insufficient to bring Iran to heel. For that, the Americans would have to commit to a ground war. Invading through Iraq would be difficult, as it would mean passing through thick swamps that favor the defender and then running straight into the Zagros Mountains. Going in through Turkey would be incredibly unlikely. Turkey did not allow the U.S. to use it as a staging base for Iraq's invasion, and relations between the U.S. and Turkey have significantly soured since then. Going through Afghanistan in the east would mean traversing 2 deserts, which would put U.S. forces far from any strategically important targets. It's likely then that an amphibious assault would be necessary, and while the U.S. Navy and Marines are up to the task, amphibious assaults can be costly, dangerous affairs. However, once in country with a beachhead established, even with superior capabilities, actually defeating Iran would be difficult for the U.S. That's thanks to the sheer size of the country, which is larger than several European countries combined. A study in the late 2000s showed that the U.S. would need about 1.6 million troops to successfully occupy the entire country, meaning the U.S. would either have to initiate conscription or draw in partners for the invasion, something it might actually be able to do given tensions in the Middle East between Iran and many of its neighbors. If the invasion was reasonably reasonably justified, the US could likely count on international support anyway. In all likelihood, Iran would try to make the US bleed as much as possible with its conventional forces, but seek to defeat it through asymmetrical means like those employed in Afghanistan. Intelligence shows that today Iran is attempting to infiltrate a network of agents into the US to target political figures such as former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who's now under guard 24/7. By turning to terrorist group allies, Iran could turn America's invasion into a second Afghanistan, and the US public has little stomach for yet another two-decade war. However, the US might be able to count on the Iranian people themselves to help them overthrow the current regime, especially if it keeps civilian casualties to a minimum. Many people in Iran are tired of living under sanctions and under the thumb of an oppressive Tehran regime, and it's likely that the US would be welcomed as liberators across much of Iran. In this regard, Iran is different from either Iraq or Afghanistan, and a lack of popular support could hinder Iran's ability to launch a successful asymmetrical campaign against US forces. In the 1984 film Red Dawn, the beleaguered Wolverines, teen partisans defending the middle of America against a Soviet and Cuban invasion, ask a downed US fighter pilot, played by Powers Booth, what started the war. His answer? The two toughest kids on the block, I guess. Sooner or later, they're gonna fight. That's the way many analysts see the current situation between the United States and its allies, primarily NATO, and China and its main military ally, Russia. With all the military spending on both sides, it only seems inevitable that they will eventually use the power they've built up to forward their global agendas. The current situation between the authoritarian East and liberal West has not been this tense in about half a century. The invasion of Ukraine has brought NATO and the United States into as close to an all-out hot war with Russia as we've seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But with that previous series of events cooled off before shots fired, the Ukrainian war has seen hundreds of thousands of casualties. Russia feels that many of the deaths on their side are due to the military and economic aid sent by NATO and the US to Ukraine. Putin and his political henchmen have repeatedly threatened NATO with nuclear weapons if they feel the existence of their country is threatened any more than it already is. Matters weren't made any better when Great Britain almost had one of its RC-135 reconnaissance planes shot down in September 2022, which would have raised tensions even more. There was another close call in November of 2022 when an errant Ukrainian air defense missile missed its intended target, another Russian missile barrage indiscriminately targeting Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, and landed in neighboring Poland, killing 2 people. NATO has a very specific section of its agreement called Article 5, which states that any attack on a member nation is an attack on all of NATO. For a moment, talks of all-out war between Russia and NATO filled the blogosphere. Russian officials have sought to paint NATO as aggressors in the war, continually claiming that the poor little Russia was directly fighting against the massive enemy of NATO, while the US and its allies have said they are supporting Ukraine's defense with military aid and unspecified intelligence sharing, but not with boots on the ground. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, China continues to make threatening gestures toward Taiwan, including recent armed jet intrusions of Taiwanese airspace following Speaker Pelosi's trip to the island in 2022, and then Speaker McCarthy's trip in 2023. Following the more recent April trip, China effectively closed Taiwan's airspace with waves of fighter jets and for the first time made it seem like they were able to interdict any U.S. support from the east of the island. There is even talk that China might begin to require ships transiting the Taiwan Strait to undergo boarding and searching, which Taiwan says they will vigorously oppose. Are we close to a hot war? First off, let's make one thing clear. The U.S. and China are not on the verge of war. On March 31, 2023, General Mark Milley, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, "I don't think at this point I would put the possibility of imminent war in the likely category, and I think that the rhetoric itself can overheat the environment." However, General Milley did admit that it is possible that you could have an incident or some other trigger event that could lead to uncontrolled escalation, so it's not impossible. That incident would most likely evolve around an attempted Chinese invasion of Taiwan. President Xi has publicly stated that he wants the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, to be prepared to take Taiwan by force as early as 2027, so that risk clearly does exist. Let's take a look at the 2 main theaters of such a potential war. NATO and the European elements of the United States' forces arrayed against Russia, and the US forces in the Pacific, mostly naval forces, against the might of the Chinese Army and Navy. Of course, such a comparison will not include the opposing nuclear forces. Any of the combatants have enough warheads to turn vast swaths of the world into unlivable nuclear wasteland. For the purposes of this comparison, we will hope that all sides would agree not to resort to such catastrophic weapons. The opposing military strengths in Europe. Before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, most of the world perceived Russia as the second most powerful military in the world. They had massive numbers of tanks and artillery, their air force was seen as a peer with the American Air Force, and their navy was capable and feared, even if it didn't have comparable numbers to the US Navy. Russia's military fiasco in Ukraine has proven their tanks are outdated and poorly designed. Their logistics vanish once they leave their rail network, and their air force has been fragile enough that they don't dare fly over Ukrainian territory for fear of being shot down. The only two legs of their military that remain unbowed by these defeats are its artillery, still numerous, though notably inaccurate, and its nuclear forces, which remain unused and still unproven. As of April 2023, the widely respected research organization Oryx has documented and confirmed an astounding 10,000 vehicle losses by the Russian armed forces, including over 1,900 main battle tanks, half of what it reportedly had pre-invasion, along with 830 armored fighting vehicles, 2,200 infantry fighting vehicles, 800 pieces of artillery, 79 aircraft, 81 helicopters, and 12 surface vessels, including the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Slava-class guided missile cruiser Moskva. This is in addition to an estimated 200,000 Russian military casualties, with anything between 45,000 to 50,000 killed in action. These numbers are incredibly high from just over a year of fighting, and are far greater even than what Russia suffered in its 10-year losing war in Afghanistan. The losses are so high that in early 2023, Russia began returning 75-year-old T-54-55s into service, the equivalent of the US using Korean War-era M47s. The Russia also lost a reported 1,500 officers, including 160 top-level generals and colonels, and it's clear the once-feared Russian military is a shell of its former self. Standing opposite the vastly depleted and shaken Russian military is NATO, now more united and stronger than at any time in its 74-year history. With Finland's admission into NATO in April of 2023 as its 31st signatory nation, the organization can now boast a combined troop strength of just over 3.5 million soldiers, airmen, and sailors. That includes, however, the US and its 1.4 million strong standing army, not all of which would be fighting in Europe, and Turkey's 425,000, not the most committed of NATO's members. That means the rest of NATO's 29 members contribute only 1.7 million troops total. France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Poland, and Italy each have 160,000 or more active personnel, while other countries have smaller forces to rely on. It must be stated, though, NATO considers itself a defensive organization. How involved they'd be beyond their own borders is anyone's guess. It's important to note that the current war in Ukraine has shown that the NATO members, mostly led by Poland and the US, are willing to supply lethal aid from missiles to artillery to tanks and fighter jets to a non-signatory nation whose defense is of a vital interest to nearby NATO members. Since Russia launched its invasion in February of 2022, NATO members have increased both their military budgets and pledged a greater amount of military spending per capita. They've also benefited from sending Ukraine their Soviet-era tanks and fighter jets, which have been replaced with upgraded models, many of them being state-of-the-art models from other member nations, like the US's F-35 stealth fighter and M1A2 Abrams tanks. NATO can also count on around 1,500 Leopard 2s and about 2,500 M1 Abrams main battle tanks, the majority of which are M1A2s, with the rest being the earlier M1A1s, with an additional 800 or so British Challenger 2s and French Leclerc and Arietes. And while the number of aircraft on both the NATO and Russian sides appear about equal, NATO forces employ more 4th and 5th generation fighters like the F-35 and the improved and updated versions of the F-16. While Russia is still reliant on more outdated MiG-29s introduced in 1982, MiG-31s introduced in 1981, and the Su-27s introduced in 1985. These three plane types alone account for more than 750 of their total 1,100 available pre-invasion fighter aircraft, a disproportionate number of outdated and non-modernized platforms. And as has been seen in Ukraine, many of these aircraft have not been maintained sufficiently in order for them to be combat-ready anytime soon. It's clear that a war between only the European forces of NATO and the struggling military of Russia would be a one-sided affair. But how would China fare against a mostly US force? The opposing forces in the Pacific. China, it should be obvious, has not suffered from an equivalent loss of military strength as Russia has over the past year. In fact, the modernization and expansion of its military has been impressive and has caused its neighbors like Japan, Australia, India, and the Philippines to increase their own military expenditures. Yet China is still missing major components that will allow it to go toe-to-toe with the US Navy. These missing elements suggest China would be better off waiting at least 5 years, and possibly as much as 10 years, before it initiates an open military confrontation with the West. For example, the People's Liberation Army Navy, the Plan, currently operates 25 of its modern 10,000-ton Type 52D destroyers, with its own version of the Aegis-type radar system, along with 8 of the more advanced 13,000-ton Type 55A destroyers, along with 6 of the earlier 7,000-ton Type 52C ships. There are up to 12 additional destroyers currently under construction. But while these ships are designed specifically for missile and aircraft defenses, they've yet to deploy with the planned HQ-26 medium-range ship-to-air missile system, which was based on the Russian 9K-37 Buk, first developed in 1972. This new missile system is reportedly equivalent to the US SM-3 missile used by the Aegis ballistic missile defense system, and was expected to be able to engage short and medium-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and both manned and unmanned aircraft out to 400 kilometers. However, this capability is expected to be implemented around a year or two from first deployment, and will be even longer before it's deployed fleet-wide. Until then, China's missile defense destroyers like the Type 52 and 55 will have to make do with the upgraded HQ-16B with a reported maximum range of only 70 kilometers, a system that dates from 2011. The biggest weakness in the plan, of course, is its aircraft carrier fleet. They currently operate 3 carriers, the oldest being a 90s-era Ukrainian-built Russian-designed ship named the Liaoning with its ski jump ramp, which is also a staple of its second carrier, the Type 002 Shandong. The Liaoning isn't really considered a frontline carrier and is relegated to the role of training carrier. Its third carrier, the Fujian, currently being fitted out, is equipped with advanced electromagnetic catapults, similar to those on the U.S. supercarrier USS Gerald R. Ford. Some say copied directly from it. But that means the plan will have to train its carrier pilots on 2 types of takeoffs, and they'll need 2 different types of carrier planes to operate on those carriers. Its current training model, the JL-9G, a single-engine twin-seat aircraft first deployed in 2011, can't be used to duplicate emergency landings on any of its current carriers because it's too weak to take the continual pounding of carrier landings, and it's too underpowered to immediately take off in case of a missed landing. That leaves only simulated takeoffs and landings on ground-based mock-ups. This inability to field a true carrier trainer has led to a huge deficit in trained carrier pilots. The problem with the planned trainer is just the opposite of its carrier combat aircraft, the J-15 Flying Shark, which was mocked by Russia for trying to be a back-engineered version of a Su-33 prototype, the T-10K3, which they bought from Ukraine back in 2001. At a reported 17.5 tons, its upgraded version is now thought to be the world's heaviest carrier-borne fighter. In comparison, the U.S. Navy's F-A-18 weighs only 14.5 tons. The J-15 suffers from either having to carry less than optimal fuel, giving it less range, or less armament, giving it less lethality if it intends to take off from the 2 ski jump-equipped carriers. It has since been nicknamed the Flopping Fish by the normally reserved Chinese press for its underwhelming performance. China's begun deployment of the Chengdu J-20, somewhat comparable to the US's F-22 stealth fighter, and have produced around 200 of them, but this aircraft cannot be adapted to carriers and remains a standard land-based air superiority fighter. China hopes to make up the difference in carrier forces with hypersonic missiles, though their reliability and readiness is still under discussion. At present, there's speculation but no confirmation that China is building a 4th carrier, though at least one recent satellite image suggests a 4th might be under construction. But the plan doesn't have enough carrier pilots for its 2 current frontline carriers, let alone a 4th. In comparison, the U.S. currently operates 11 carrier strike groups, each of which is comprised of one of its nuclear propulsion Nimitz or Ford-class supercarriers able to field 70 to 80 aircraft, 1 or 2 Ticonderoga-class Aegis-guided missile cruisers for air defense and coordination, 2 LAMPS-capable warships focusing on anti-submarine and surface warfare, and 2 to 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers. Each strike group is accompanied by assorted logistics and support ships and an undisclosed number of nuclear-powered attack submarines, usually 1 or 2, that coordinate with each strike group. The new Ford-class supercarriers currently in use by the U.S. Navy are undoubtedly the most powerful warships ever produced, with 1 in service and 4 more planned or currently under construction to be delivered between 2024 and 2034. There are literally no carrier groups of such lethality in any navy in the world, though the British and French navies do have their own carrier battle groups with somewhat comparable strengths. The U.S. also deploys several amphibious-ready groups built around the Wasp-class amphibious assault ships, in essence a small carrier. which can handle 6 fighters like the F-35 Lightning II and up to 24 helicopters like the Cobra gunship and the VF-22 Osprey transport vehicles. The amphibious-ready groups also include a landing platform dock ship (LPD) from the San Antonio class, capable of deploying up to 600 troops and 14 amphibious assault vehicles, and a landing ship dock (LSD) like the Harper's Ferry class and the Whidbey Island class landing ships, which can load and unload conventional landing craft and helicopters. These amphibious-ready groups can also launch dozens of autonomous drones like the X-47B. Normally 2 to 3 ARGs are forward deployed, one in the Mediterranean Sea or the Persian Gulf/Indian Ocean region, and 1 or 2 in the Western Pacific Ocean area. Currently, 1 ARG is based out of Sasebo and Okinawa, Japan. The ARGs are usually attached to a carrier strike group, which provides protection for them from both land and sea-based attacks. The U.S. can also count on 26 Los Angeles-class, 3 Seawolf-class, and 21 Virginia-class nuclear-powered attack submarines, as well as dozens of ballistic missile submarines, each with ICBM-capable launch tubes. On the other hand, the plan operates 6 Shang-class nuclear submarines and 40 older diesel-electric submarines of much lower capability. Many experts point to the plan's superiority in total numbers of ships over the U.S. Navy, 340 to 300, but we must consider that the plan's numbers include 150 patrol craft, which are more equivalent to the U.S. Coast Guard's cutters, designed for coastal engagements only, and not really capable of the kind of blue water combat the main naval units would engage in. In addition, while the U.S. Navy appears perfectly capable of handling the current plan on its own, any shooting war will likely involve other countries that are either wary of or outright opposed to Chinese naval power projection, including Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, and India. Following continued efforts by China to claim the entire South China Sea as their own personal swimming pool, each of these countries has begun to beef up their own naval might. Japan, for instance, is building 2 of the largest destroyers in the world. At 20,000 tons, they dwarf even the U.S.'s 16,000-ton Zumwalt destroyers. These will complement and support Japan's 2 new Izumo and Kaga carriers, converted from previous helicopter destroyers, and will operate the F-35B Joint Strike Fighter. Once complete, the 2 carriers will be Japan's first since the Second World War. Along with Japan's increasing naval might, Australia has entered into a long-term agreement with the US and Great Britain to build a fleet of state-of-the-art nuclear-powered attack submarines. India has also increased its own naval strength, while the country is still aching from violent confrontations instigated by China along its northern Himalayan border. China's true Achilles heel. And that brings up the most crucial component of any possible shooting war involving China: the fact that the country must import 70 to 75% of all their oil and natural gas through a long naval route from the Baltic through the Atlantic and past Africa, India, and Indonesia. If the US or its Pacific allies wanted to interdict the flow of petroleum to China, and such a lengthy supply chain would be impossible for China to protect, then China would be looking at a 3-month delay before its countrywide truck transport system would shut down due to a lack of fuel, and 6 months before it ran out of the necessary components for the production of fertilizers, which its farmers desperately need. Their economy would collapse within a year, and massive famine would break out even if they did manage to hold off the superior US Navy. This dramatic and inevitable failure of their economy and the catastrophic famine that would follow might be the main reason why China isn't looking to launch a full-scale war anytime soon. Not only is it a heavy importer of raw petroleum, it's also the world's largest importer of food. Between 2000 and 2020, the country's food self-sufficiency ratio decreased from 93.6% to 65.8%. China's leaders know that if it cannot win a war outright in a very short period of a few months, and the vast capabilities of the US Navy, let alone its numerous Pacific allies, suggest that this just isn't a reliable possibility, then they are dooming their country to losing their position as the second most powerful economy in the world, with a disastrous famine soon to follow. The lessons of the Ukraine war are also a stark reminder that a determined, well-equipped country, no matter how small, can resist an invader far more easily with today's advanced technological weapons. And while Ukraine has done a phenomenal job in gaining that capability in a mere 8 years since the first Russian invasion of 2014, Taiwan has been preparing itself for a Chinese invasion for more than 70 years. They're also a much more technologically capable nation and have a large 80-mile moat of an ocean that China would have to navigate in case of an invasion. This would not be an easy cross-border incursion that Russia attempted and failed, but it would require dozens of landing craft, easy targets for missiles, and waiting artillery. The fragility of a Russia-China alliance. In addition to logistical problems of overcoming the US Navy and the watery moat around Taiwan, China faces another hurdle: the weakness of any long-term alliance with Russia, an alliance that would merely be a castle built upon sand. Any full-scale war short of a nuclear engagement would find Russia's military virtually destroyed within the first few weeks of the conflict's launch, leaving China virtually alone. The Ukrainian invasion has spotlighted why Russia is nowhere near the military peer to the US, China, or even NATO that people thought it was. As previously mentioned, the Russian armed forces have lost over 10,000 military vehicles, including upwards of 1,900 main battle tanks, along with around 200,000 troops. The main reason they threaten the West so often with nuclear weapons is because they know they never stand a chance against the combined forces of NATO, which have more advanced equipment and better trained troops, and now might actually hold a numerical advantage as well. There are multiple reasons for the failure of the Russian military. First and foremost is the endemic corruption that riddles every layer of the Russian government, including the military. There are estimates that corruption has cost from 25 to 30% of Russia's total annual GDP, and the sanctions Russia has endured since the start of the war has caused a massive drain of its remaining economy. Not only is Russia's economy collapsing due to the surprisingly efficient Western sanctions, but that smaller economy's spending on its military is actually much less than the projected numbers. The sanctions have also shrunk the Russian economy to the size of Italy, and now puts it behind the individual states of California, Texas, or New York. Russia's nominal $1.4 trillion GDP is minuscule when compared to the EU's combined economic strength of about $15.28 trillion. Add the US and the EU's GDP together, you get about $35 trillion, more than 40% of the total world GDP. Russia will simply never be able to outspend the EU and its NATO counterpart, much less the US and EU combined. Second, Russia has never had a coherent NCO training program. Russia has lost at least 150 officers of colonel rank and above simply because their orders have to be passed almost directly from the leadership to the frontline troops. The members of NATO, the US, and even China understand that the sergeants and other NCOs have to have the independent authority to assess the war from the front lines and make immediate and effective changes in response. Russia has never had that level of independence, which leads their military to dogmatic, inflexible attacks that usually require masses of tanks, waves of infantry, and massive artillery bombardments, none of which are effective in a modern battlefield environment that is overwatched by drones, surveillance satellites, and reconnaissance planes. Third, Russia has never had the ability to manage their logistics at any distance from their rail network. The ignominious 40-mile-long traffic jam north of Kyiv from late February to March of 2022 was one glaring example of how their military cannot perform the simple task of keeping their tanks and transports full of fuel and moving. This lack of logistics has been further exacerbated by the introduction of HIMARS long-range rocket artillery systems, which can hit targets over 50 miles away, and newer smart ammunition including ground-launched small-diameter bombs, GLSDB, which can hit targets 93 miles away. These have been used to great success by the Ukrainian forces against Russian depots that have often been placed too close to the front, mostly due to their lack of logistical transport capabilities. The inherent weakness of an unequal partnership. There are additional signs that China is aware of Russia's much weaker role in any potential alliance and has been capitalizing on this inequality for some time now. At first, it was the Soviet Union that held a predominant role in any bilateral negotiations, allowing them to bully China into accepting unequal agreements. Things got so bad that the two countries almost launched a major war over a border dispute in 1969, one of several border disputes between the two countries since the 1920s. But Russia eventually decided it was better to arm the Chinese government in order to have an ally against the West. China, however, decided on its own that it'd be better to copy and/or steal whatever they could get, rather than pay the full price for products coming from the Soviet Union. Starting in the 1990s, China has openly copied or stolen Russian technology, leading at times to Russia having to swallow their pride as China sold knockoffs of their own frontline equipment. For example, in 1996, China debuted the J-11 aircraft, the first fighter made after the fall of the Soviet Union to feature significant Russian input. At first, it was an officially licensed Chinese-made copy of the Russian Su-27 multi-role fighter, whose sales were welcomed by the cash-poor post-Soviet state. Before long, however, China canceled their agreement and began producing the aircraft independently, eventually building over 400 unauthorized J-11s, equaling an economic loss to the USSR of more than $10 billion. Russia continues to sell its best or almost best military gear to China, even though they know the technology is likely to be copied, reducing what little technological superiority Russia still maintains over China. The policy dilemma has been compounded by the post-Ukraine effect on Russia's struggling manufacturing sector, which has left the shrinking Russian economy increasingly reliant on China's much larger economic base, further eroding any remaining compatibility in their relationship. More recently, President Xi has tried to bring China to the forefront in worldwide diplomacy. So when the UN held a vote to condemn the Russian invasion, China surprisingly abstained from the 141-5 vote to condemn the invasion, and in fact was a key leader of 34 other countries who also abstained. This was the first time that China had a chance to publicly support their, quote, partner, and they openly refused. This hands-off approach demonstrates China's desire to maintain its currently neutral stance regarding the Ukraine war in hopes of trying to establish Beijing's bid for global leadership. But they can't do that if they supplied lethal aid to Russia, so they refuse to supply such support despite Putin's pleas to the contrary. When President Putin and Xi met in Russia of March 2023, Putin had hoped that Xi would offer a deal to create a direct pipeline between the two countries, making China more reliant on Russian crude oil and natural gas and giving Russia a direct buyer for their primary export. But no such agreement was reached. Xi did say publicly that China and Russia would continue to resolutely uphold the fundamental norms of international relations based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. But that statement blatantly ignores the illegality of Russia's invasion in the first place, which directly violates the Charter's core precepts. Putin's hopes for any concrete agreements for aid or mutual development never materialized. The summit was summed up by historian Sergei Radchenko with an old Chinese proverb, "Loud thunder but few raindrops." He then modified that statement as, "Scratch that, even the thunder wasn't all that loud." In fact, the Putin-Xi meetings actually caused further support for Ukraine, as Japanese Prime Minister Kishida used the opportunity to make a surprise trip to Ukraine to meet with President Zelensky. Despite Xi's efforts to lead China into a role of peacekeeper and world negotiator, he still has to deal with the hawks in his own government. On the heels of the Moscow summit, the Guangming Daily wrote an extensive article, more of a semi-official position piece declaring the four no's that China says they will not put up with. Number 1, the US should not make irresponsible remarks on normal exchanges between sovereign states. Number 2, the US should not compare China-Russia relations with a small circle of US allies. Number 3, the US should not undermine China's efforts to promote peace talks on the Ukraine issue. Number 4, the US should stop using the Ukraine crisis as an excuse to attack and sanction China. Some of this rhetoric is no doubt simply strong words, but they may also signal an effort to lay the groundwork for China to ramp up its military support for Russia's war, though so far there's no evidence of that. It gets worse for Russia. In addition to everything else that bodes ill for Russia, President Xi might not be willing to go all in on supporting a leader of Russia whose future appears very uncertain. Putin's been rumored to be in ill health for years. He was filmed walking with a limp when he visited Crimea in March of 2023. And in April, there were widespread reports that he had suffered from intense head pain, a numb tongue, and blurred vision. There have been numerous indications he might be suffering from Parkinson's disease, which manifests as an uncontrollable shaking in the extremities, primarily the hands and feet. And there are additional signs he might be undergoing chemotherapy, which can result in excessive weight gain. There's also signs that Putin has killed off anyone near him that might pose a threat to his continued dominance of the Russian government. Since just before the invasion of Ukraine, over 40 of Russia's top managers, businessmen, and high-level officials have died under unclear but very suspicious circumstances. Those deaths include being found in apparent murder-suicides, like Vladislav Aveyev, vice president of Gazprom Bank, and his pregnant wife and 13-year-old daughter, who were found dead in a Moscow apartment, while a former top manager of Novatek, Sergei Protosenya, was found hanged at his villa in Spain, with his wife and 18-year-old daughter also found murdered in the house. And Pavel Pshelnikov, director of communications at Digital Logistics LLC, a subsidiary of Russian Railways, supposedly shot himself at his home in Moscow. The deaths have become so numerous that one media source has given the wave a nickname, Sudden Russian Death Syndrome. But by and far, the most conspicuous means of death has been the archaic mid-18th century habit of defenestration, that is, falling out of a high window. Ravil Maganov, vice president of Lukoil, fell out of one at the Central Clinical Hospital of the presidential administration in Moscow. And in February 2023, Marina Yankina, head of the financial department of the defense ministry, was found dead after supposedly falling from a 16th floor of her apartment. Even when a suspect is in government custody, their lives aren't safe. Most recently, Igor Shikurko, Deputy General Director of firm Yakutsk was discovered dead of unknown causes in his cell in a detention center in Yakutsk, Siberia on April 5, 2023. The extremely high number of potentially murdered rivals paints Russia in a bad light, an unstable dictatorship afraid of its own best and brightest while making enemies of its own nascent leadership. Couple that with Putin's rumored ill health, and it's just one more reason why President Xi may want to wait a year or two before cementing any permanent relationships with whoever's in charge in Russia post-Ukraine. What will Russia and Ukraine do? China and Russia are in an unenviable position. Both countries are seeing an inevitable shrinking of their populations, with China admitting an overcounting of its population during the last census by as much as 100 million. The Pew Research Center forecasts a decline from 1.4 billion people this year to 1.3 billion by 2050 and a staggering reduction to below 800 million by 2100. That's according to the UN's medium variant, or middle-of-the-road projection. Russia's upside-down population pyramid is no better. They're already experiencing a massive brain drain as a repercussion from its Ukraine fiasco, which was followed by as many as 400,000 young men who left to avoid the first conscription call-up in September 2022. Combine that with an aging population, a lower birth rate, and a decrease in life expectancy of 15 years since early 2022, and Russia's population is in free fall. Both these troubled countries might believe then that their only window to have enough young males to support a war is rapidly shrinking. That leaves Putin and Xi with a difficult, if not impossible, decision: launch a war now that they're not ready for and probably can't win, or wait a few years when their populations and economies are even less capable of enduring such hardships. It's an unenviable decision for any leader to make. Want to get a glimpse into what an East versus West nuclear war would look like? Check out I Survived 100 Days of World War III, or click this other video instead.